Welcome, moonlit souls. Tonight's tale will sweep you into a world where ancient bloodlines clash with modern hearts, where a forgotten Omega's love burns bright enough to heal even the most cursed Alpha, and where destiny refuses to be denied. Before we begin this journey of forbidden passion, betrayal, and redemption, don't forget to howl at that like button, share this story with your pack, and subscribe to Wolf Heart Tales for more supernatural romances that will leave your heart racing beneath the full moon. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Omega. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Crimson Academy like ghostly fingers tapping out secrets in Morse code. Celeste Rivers pressed her face against the cold glass of the literature classroom, watching silver droplets race down the pane as if they were tears shed by the gray October sky. Her wolf, Luna, stirred restlessly beneath her skin, a constant reminder of the power she carried but could never quite claim in a world that had already decided her worth. Miss Rivers. The sharp voice of Professor Whitmore cut through her reverie like a blade. Perhaps you'd care to share your thoughts on the assigned reading rather than conducting a meteorological study? Heat flooded Celeste's cheeks as snickers rippled through the classroom. She straightened in her seat, her fingers automatically smoothing down the uneven pigtails that never seemed to cooperate no matter how carefully she tied them each morning. Her oversized sweater, a hand-me-down from a cousin who'd outgrown it 3 sizes ago, suddenly felt even more conspicuous among the designer uniforms that surrounded her. "I was just thinking about how the rain mirrors the protagonist's internal struggle," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying past the first row. "The way external elements often reflect our inner turmoil." Professor Whitmore's eyebrows rose in what might have been a surprise. "Interesting observation. Though perhaps next time you could focus that analytical mind on the lesson rather than the weather." As the professor's attention moved elsewhere, Celeste caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of her eye. 3 rows ahead and 2 seats to the right sat the reason her concentration had been scattered to the 4 winds for the better part of 2 years. Demon Blackthorn. Even his name seemed to carry weight in the supernatural world, whispered in hallways with a mixture of awe, desire, and carefully concealed fear. He was everything she was not, commanding where she was invisible, confident where she was awkward, born to rule where she was destined to follow. His midnight black hair caught the fluorescent light as he turned slightly, offering her a glimpse of the sharp profile that had haunted her dreams since her 16th birthday. Luna whimpered softly in her mind, a sound of longing that Celeste knew all too well. "He'll never see us," she whispered to her wolf spirit. "We're not even on his radar." But oh, how she wished they were. Demon Blackthorn was the heir apparent to the most powerful pack in the Northeastern Territories. His family's influence stretched far beyond the supernatural community. Their business empire, Obsidian Tower Corporation, had tentacles reaching into technology, real estate, and dozens of other industries that kept both human and supernatural worlds spinning. He walked through the halls of Crimson Academy like a prince surveying his future kingdom, surrounded by a carefully curated circle of friends who hung on his every word. And then there was Celeste Rivers, whose family claimed no territory, owned no businesses, and whose greatest achievement was maintaining a 4.0 GPA while working part-time at the local bookstore to help her grandmother pay for her academy tuition. She was what the supernatural hierarchy coldly classified as an Omega, not just in the biological sense that meant she could bear powerful offspring, but in the social sense that meant she was expected to submit, to serve, to remain grateful for whatever scraps of attention the higher-ranked wolves might deign to toss her way. The bell's sharp ring jolted her from her thoughts, and suddenly the classroom erupted into motion. Students gathered their belongings with the practiced efficiency of those eager to escape to more interesting pursuits. Celeste took her time, carefully placing her worn textbooks into her equally worn backpack, hoping the crowd would thin before she had to navigate the hallway gauntlet. She was almost successful. She'd made it halfway to her locker when disaster struck in the form of Madison Cross, a beta-ranked wolf whose family held considerable sway in pack politics and who seemed to view making Celeste's life miserable as her personal calling. Well, Madison's voice carried that particular tone that meant trouble was brewing. "If it isn't our resident charity case." Celeste's steps faltered, but she kept walking, hoping against hope that ignoring the provocation might make it go away. It never did. "I'm talking to you, Rivers." Madison stepped directly into her path, flanked by two of her followers like some sort of teenage pack formation. "Didn't your grandmother teach you basic manners? When your superiors speak to you, you're supposed to respond." The hallway seemed to grow quiet around them, conversations dying as other students sensed the brewing confrontation. This was entertainment for them, watching the pack hierarchy play out in real time, a reminder of where everyone stood in the carefully maintained social order. "I don't want any trouble, Madison," Celeste said quietly, clutching her backpack's straps like lifelines. Madison's laugh was sharp and brittle. "Trouble? Oh, honey, you don't get to want things. That's not how this works." She stepped closer, invading Celeste's personal space with the casual cruelty that came so naturally to those born into power. "You exist at our sufferance. The least you can do is show proper respect." Luna snarled in Celeste's mind, hackles raised and ready for a fight that her human counterpart couldn't afford to start. Not here. Not now, not when she was so outnumbered and outranked that any retaliation would be seen as an unprovoked attack on her betters. "Is there a problem here?" The voice that cut through the tension was like liquid fire poured over velvet, warm, commanding, and utterly unmistakable. Celeste's heart stuttered in her chest as Demon Blackthorn materialized at the edge of their little circle, his presence instantly shifting the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Madison's aggressive posture melted into something approximating gracious femininity so quickly it might have been comedic under different circumstances. "Oh, Demon. No problem at all. We were just having a little chat with Celeste about academy etiquette." Demon's dark eyes swept over the scene, taking in Madison's false smile, her followers' suddenly uncertain expressions, and finally landing on Celeste herself. For one heart-stopping moment, their gazes met and held. She saw something flicker in those obsidian depths. Was it recognition? Concern? Or just mild curiosity about the disturbance? "I see," he said, his tone perfectly neutral. "Well, I'd hate to interrupt such an educational conversation. But Madison, didn't you mention you needed to speak with me about the upcoming formal?" It was a masterful deflection, offering Madison exactly what she wanted, his attention, while simultaneously removing her from the situation without making it seem like he was taking sides. Madison practically preened as she allowed herself to be drawn away, her followers trailing behind like well-trained satellites. But before he left, Demon turned back to Celeste one more time. "You dropped this," he said, holding out a small slip of paper. She frowned, confused, as she took the paper from his fingers. The brief contact sent electricity shooting up her arm, a sensation so intense that Luna practically howled with recognition. But when she looked down at the paper, she realized it wasn't hers at all. Written in bold, confident handwriting were the words, "Library, 3rd floor, after school. Come alone." By the time she looked up, he was already disappearing around the corner with Madison chattering at his side. The rest of the school day passed in a haze of anticipation and anxiety. Celeste found herself checking the clock obsessively, her mind spinning through a dozen different scenarios of what Demon Blackthorn could possibly want with her. Was this some elaborate prank? A setup orchestrated by Madison for maximum humiliation? Or, and this thought made her heart race even faster, could it possibly be genuine interest? Luna paced restlessly in her consciousness, equally agitated by the morning's encounter. "Something's different about him," her wolf insisted. "Did you feel that spark when he touched us?" She had felt it, a jolt of recognition so primal and powerful that it had nearly knocked her off her feet. But she'd learned long ago not to read too much into such things. Wolves were naturally tactile creatures, and what felt earth-shaking to her sheltered senses might be nothing more than normal supernatural contact to someone of Demon's experience and power. When the final bell rang, Celeste made her way to the library, with her pulse thundering in her ears. The 3rd floor was the restricted section, ancient texts on pack law, supernatural history, and advanced magic that most students weren't allowed to access without special permission. It was also, conveniently, the most isolated part of the entire building. She found him standing beside one of the tall windows that looked out over the academy grounds, his silhouette dramatic against the dying afternoon light. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, giving him a more approachable air than his usual impeccably polished appearance. "You came," he said without turning around, his voice carrying a note of what might have been relief. "You asked me to." The words came out more breathless than she'd intended, and she cleared her throat, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. He turned then, and she was struck anew by the sheer presence he commanded. Demon Blackthorn was tall, at least 6 feet 4 inches, with the kind of lean, powerful build that spoke of hours spent training in both human and wolf form. His features were sharp and aristocratic, all clean lines and elegant bones that suggested centuries of careful breeding among the pack elite. But it was his eyes that truly captured attention, dark as midnight and older than his 18 years should have allowed, as if he carried the weight of his family's entire legacy in their depths. "I wanted to apologize," he said, taking a step closer, "for Madison's behavior earlier. She gets territorial sometimes." Celeste blinked in surprise. "You don't need to apologize for her actions." "Don't I?" He tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. "She's part of my social circle. Her behavior reflects on me, on my family standards. And more importantly," he took another step closer, near enough now that she could catch a scent, cedar and smoke with an underlying note of something wild and dangerous. "I don't like seeing anyone treated that way." The sincerity in his voice caught her completely off guard. This wasn't the arrogant alpha heir she'd observed from afar, the one who accepted tribute and admiration as his natural due. This was someone else entirely, someone with actual depth behind those beautiful, haunted eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she spoke any louder. They stood there in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by the musty scent of old books and the weight of unspoken possibilities. Celeste felt as if she were balanced on the edge of a cliff, one wrong move away from falling into something that would change her forever. "Can I ask you something?" Demon's voice was softer now, almost vulnerable. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? Like the person everyone expects you to be isn't who you really are inside?" The question hit her with unexpected force. She'd spent so many years being dismissed, overlooked, defined by what she lacked rather than what she possessed, that she'd almost forgotten there might be anything authentic left beneath the layers of social conditioning. Every day, she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the perfect mask that allowed her to glimpse the young man beneath the air, the individual struggling beneath the weight of generational expectations. "I know what that's like," he said quietly. "Being raised to fill a role that doesn't quite fit, trained to want things you're not sure you actually want." His eyes found hers again, and this time there was no mistaking the genuine connection sparking between them. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to just be myself. Without the title, without the expectations, without everyone watching and judging my every move." "What would that look like?" she asked, genuinely curious. "If you could be anyone you wanted, who would you choose to be?" He was quiet for so long that she wondered if she'd overstepped somehow, pushed past the boundaries of what someone like her was allowed to ask someone like him. But then his lips curved into the first truly genuine smile she'd ever seen from him, not the practiced charm he wore like armor, but something real and unguarded and heartbreakingly beautiful. "I think," he said slowly, "I'd choose to be the kind of person worthy of someone who sees the world the way you do. Someone brave enough to speak truth to power, smart enough to find beauty in rain and literature, strong enough to keep standing even when everyone around them insists they should fall." The words hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible canyon. Celeste felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sensation of being truly seen for the first time in her life. "Demon," she began, but he shook his head. "I should go," he said, the mask sliding back into place so quickly she almost wondered if she'd imagined the vulnerability. "I have a family dinner tonight, and my grandfather doesn't tolerate lateness." He started toward the door, then paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. Celeste. The way he said her name, like it was something precious rather than just another entry in the student directory, made her breath catch. Thank you for answering my question honestly. It's been a long time since someone did that. And then he was gone, leaving her alone among the ancient books with her heart racing and Luna singing wordlessly in her mind. She stood there as the shadows lengthened around her, trying to make sense of what had just happened, trying to understand how her entire world could shift on its axis in the space of a single conversation. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a sound of longing and recognition that echoed the feelings stirring in her chest. She didn't know it then, but that moment in the library would be the first thread in a tapestry of fate that would ultimately bind their lives together in ways neither of them could imagine. The Shadow Alpha and the Forgotten Omega, standing on opposite sides of an ancient divide, had just taken their first tentative steps toward a destiny that would challenge everything their world believed about power, hierarchy, and the true meaning of strength. But that night, as Celeste walked home through streets slick with rain, all she knew was that for the first time in her life, she felt like she mattered. Like she was more than just background noise in someone else's story. Like she might actually be the heroine of her own tale. Chapter 2. Shadows and Secrets. The Blackthorn family estate loomed against the night sky like something conjured from Gothic nightmares and old-world power. Towering spires reached toward the moon with architectural arrogance, while gargoyles perched along the roofline seemed to watch the world below with stone eyes that missed nothing. Ancient oak trees, their branches gnarled with centuries of secrets, formed a natural barrier around the property, a living wall that kept the outside world at bay and the family's business contained within. Demon sat in the back of the family's armored sedan, watching the familiar landscape roll past through bulletproof windows. The driver, Marcus, had served the Blackthorn family for over 3 decades and knew better than to attempt conversation during these evening rides. The silence was comfortable, broken only by the whisper of tires on asphalt and the distant rumble of thunder promising another storm. But tonight, the usual heaviness that accompanied family dinners felt different. Tonight, Demon carried with him the memory of golden afternoon light filtering through library windows and the sound of Celeste Rivers speaking truth with a courage that put his own carefully constructed facades to shame. Someone brave enough to speak truth to power, he told her, describing the kind of person he wished he could be. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd found exactly that quality in the last person his family's rigid hierarchy would ever consider worthy of notice. The sedan pulled through the estate's iron gates, each bearing the Blackthorn coat of arms, a silver wolf rampant against a field of midnight blue, surrounded by symbols of power and protection that dated back to the family's origins in the old country. The circular drive was illuminated by gas lanterns that cast dancing shadows across perfectly manicured grounds, creating an atmosphere that somehow managed to be both beautiful and vaguely threatening. "Thank you, Marcus," Demon said as the car came to a stop before the mansion's imposing front entrance. "I'll walk back to the academy tonight. I need the air." The older man nodded in the rear-view mirror, his weathered face showing no surprise. He'd been driving young Blackthorns long enough to recognize the signs of a wolf who needed to run off restless energy after enduring family obligations. The massive front door opened before Demon could reach for the brass knocker, another long-time family tradition that spoke to the estate's supernatural awareness. Mrs. Chun, the head housekeeper who'd practically raised him after his parents' deaths, stood waiting with the same mixture of maternal warmth and professional discretion she'd shown him since childhood. "Your grandfather is waiting in the study," she said, helping him out of his academy blazer with practiced efficiency. "Dinner will be served in 20 minutes. He's particularly focused tonight." The warning in her tone made Demon's jaw tighten. Magnus Blackthorn was always focused, but there were degrees to his intensity that seasoned family retainers learned to recognize and fear. A particularly focused Magnus usually meant someone was about to have their life rearranged according to his vision of proper pack hierarchy and family advancement. Did he mention what captured his attention? Demon asked, knowing Mrs. Chen's network of household staff often provided better intelligence than any formal briefing. The Riverside Pack has formally requested an alliance meeting, she said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. And there's been talk about introducing you to the Alpha's daughter at the upcoming Harvest Moon celebration. Demon felt something cold and sharp settle in his stomach. Alliance meetings meant political marriages, carefully orchestrated breeding arrangements designed to strengthen pack bloodlines and consolidate power. He'd known this day would come, had been raised with the understanding that his personal desires would always be secondary to the family's supernatural empire, but somehow he'd hoped to have more time before the cage door swung shut. "I see," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Thank you for the warning." Mrs. Chen squeezed his shoulder gently, a small gesture that conveyed decades of affection and understanding. She'd seen every Blackthorn heir struggle with the weight of expectation, watched as duty and desire waged war in the hearts of young wolves who'd never been allowed to choose their own paths. The study was exactly as Demon remembered from childhood, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with rare texts on pack law and supernatural history, a massive fireplace that cast dancing shadows across Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes, and behind an antique mahogany desk that had once belonged to a European count, the man who had shaped the modern supernatural hierarchy through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. Magnus Blackthorn looked exactly like what he was, a wolf who had spent over 6 decades accumulating power and learning how to wield it with surgical precision. His silver hair was perfectly styled despite the late hour, his tailored suit showed no signs of the day's wear, and his ice blue eyes held the kind of calculating intelligence that had turned the Blackthorn name into legend among both supernatural and human communities. "You're late," he said without looking up from the documents spread across his desk. "Traffic was heavier than expected," Demon replied, settling into one of the leather chairs that faced his grandfather's position of authority. Magnus finally raised his eyes, and Demon felt the familiar weight of that penetrating stare, the look of a predator assessing everything from threat level to potential usefulness. "Traffic. How mundane. I trust your final semester at Crimson Academy is proceeding according to expectations." It was a loaded question, and they both knew it. According to expectations, in Magnus' vocabulary meant maintaining perfect grades, building strategic relationships with other pack heirs, and avoiding any complications that might interfere with the family's long-term plans. "My grades remain exemplary," Demon said carefully. Professor Whitmore commented that my analysis of supernatural legal precedents was particularly insightful. "Good." Magnus leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in a gesture that had intimidated pack leaders across 3 states. "Your education has been a considerable investment, and I expect appropriate returns. Speaking of which, I've received some interesting intelligence regarding your social interactions." Demon felt his wolf stir uneasily in his chest, recognizing the subtle shift in his grandfather's tone that preceded uncomfortable revelations. "Oh. It seems you intervened in a hallway altercation today involving Madison Cross and some lesser-ranked student." Magnus' voice carried the kind of casual dismissal that reduced people to categories and statistics. "While I appreciate your instinct to maintain order, I want to ensure you understand the delicate nature of pack social dynamics." The careful phrasing made Demon's teeth clench. His grandfather hadn't mentioned Celeste by name, but the omission felt deliberate, a way of reducing her to nothing more than a footnote in a conversation about more important matters. "The situation was handled appropriately," Demon said, proud of how level his voice remained. "I'm sure it was. You've been well trained in diplomacy." Magnus stood and moved to the window that overlooked the estate's gardens, his silhouette imposing against the night sky. "However, I want to discuss a more pressing matter. The Riverside Pack has formally proposed an alliance, and Alpha Morrison has specifically requested a meeting between you and his daughter, Valentina." There it was, the cage door, swinging shut with all the inevitability of sunrise. Demon had met Valentina Morrison at various pack functions over the years. She was beautiful, intelligent, well-educated, and possessed exactly the kind of pedigree that would strengthen the Blackthorn bloodline for generations. She was also utterly boring, with all the personality of expensive wallpaper and a laugh that sounded like it had been manufactured in the same factory that produced her perfect wardrobe. "I see," Demon said, because some response was expected. "The Harvest Moon celebration will provide the perfect opportunity for a formal introduction," Magnus continued, apparently taking his grandson's silence as agreement. "The Morrison pack controls significant territory along the eastern seaboard, and their business interests complement our own beautifully. A union between our families would create a supernatural dynasty that could influence policy on both local and national levels." The casual way his grandfather discussed rearranging his entire life, as if love, passion, and personal choice were inconvenient variables in an otherwise straightforward business transaction, made Demon's wolf snarl with barely contained rage. "Have you considered my preferences in this matter?" The question emerged before he could stop it, carrying more challenge than was wise when dealing with Magnus Blackthorn. His grandfather turned slowly, ice-blue eyes narrowing with a kind of dangerous focus that had made grown alphas reconsider their life choices. "Your preferences? How refreshingly naive. Tell me, Demon, do you believe your preferences built this empire? Do you think personal desires created the Blackthorn name's reputation for power and excellence?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Magnus moved closer, each step deliberate and predatory. "Your father had preferences as well. He preferred romantic adventures over strategic alliances, preferred following his heart over his responsibilities. And where did those preferences lead him?" The mention of his parents hit like a physical blow. Demon had been 12 when they died, old enough to understand that the car accident that claimed their lives had been anything but accidental, young enough to be haunted by nightmares of what their final moments must have been like. "They died protecting their pack," Demon said quietly, the words carrying years of grief and barely acknowledged anger. "They died because your father made enemies by prioritizing personal satisfaction over political necessity," Magnus corrected coldly. "Because he chose passion over prudence and left his son orphaned and his pack vulnerable. I will not watch you repeat his mistakes." The study fell silent except for the crackling of logs in the fireplace and the distant rumble of thunder growing closer. Demon stared at his grandfather, seeing not the man who had raised him and shaped his understanding of strength and leadership, but the architect of a system that reduced people to chess pieces and love to liability. "The Morrison alliance will be formalized within 6 months," Magnus continued, his tone indicating the discussion was over rather than ongoing. "I suggest you spend that time preparing yourself mentally for the responsibilities that await. A Blackthorn alpha cannot afford the luxury of romantic sentimentality." "And if I refuse?" The question was pure impulse, born from hours of suppressed frustration and the memory of golden eyes that saw him as something more than just an heir to a throne he'd never asked to inherit. Magnus smiled, an expression so cold it could have frozen hellfire. "You won't refuse. Because despite your momentary rebellion, you understand what's at stake. Our pack's survival, our family's legacy, the stability of the supernatural hierarchy itself. You're too intelligent and too well-trained to sacrifice all of that for teenage infatuation." The dismissal stung precisely because it contained just enough truth to be devastating. Was that all his interest in Celeste represented? Teenage infatuation with a girl whose very existence challenged everything his world had taught him about worth and value? Mrs. Chen's gentle knock on the study door interrupted the tense silence. "Dinner is served, Mr. Blackthorn." Excellent timing. Magnus straightened his cufflinks with the same precision he applied to every aspect of his life. "Demon, I trust this conversation has clarified your priorities. The family's future depends on your ability to think strategically rather than sentimentally." Dinner proceeded with a formal choreography that had defined Blackthorn family meals for generations. The dining room was a monument to old-world elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across antique silver, while portraits of previous family patriarchs watched from gilded frames with eyes that seemed to judge each generation's worthiness to carry the bloodline forward. Demon responded to his grandfather's conversation with the appropriate level of engagement, discussing academy politics, pack business developments, and his plans for the transition from heir to active leadership. But beneath the surface performance, his mind kept drifting to a third-floor library where someone had spoken to him like he was a person rather than a position, where golden eyes had seen past his careful masks to glimpse the man struggling beneath the weight of expectation. After dinner, Magnus retired to his private office for international calls, a business that spanned multiple continents and required the kind of delicate negotiation that had made the Blackthorn name synonymous with supernatural power. Demon made his excuses and stepped out onto the estate's grounds, breathing in the crisp autumn air that carried the promise of approaching storm. The moon hung low and heavy above the tree line, its silver light transforming the familiar landscape into something magical and otherworldly. Demon loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, allowing himself to finally drop the careful composure that family dinners demanded. His wolf stirred restlessly, wanting to shift and run through the ancient forests that bordered the estate, to lose himself in the simple clarity of hunt and instinct that made so much more sense than human politics and arranged marriages. But he remained in human form, knowing that running wouldn't solve the fundamental problem of being caught between duty and desire, between the life he'd been raised to live and the possibility of something authentic and real. He thought about Celeste's question, if you could be anyone you wanted, who would you choose to be? For years, he'd assumed the answer was obvious. He would choose to be worthy of the Blackthorn legacy, strong enough to carry the family's expectations, intelligent enough to navigate supernatural politics without losing himself in the process. But now, walking through moonlit gardens while thunder rumbled overhead, he found himself wondering if there might be other kinds of worthiness, other definitions of strength. What would it be like to be worthy of someone who valued truth over status, who found beauty in rain and literature rather than power and position? What would it feel like to be chosen for who he actually was rather than what he represented? His phone buzzed with a text message, pulling him back to present reality. The sender was listed as unknown, but the message itself made his heart race. Thank you for today. For the first time in years, I felt like I mattered. I know this probably sounds foolish, but I wanted you to know that your kindness meant more than you could possibly realize. S. Demon stared at the screen, reading the words over and over. Celeste had somehow gotten his number, probably through academy directories or mutual connections, and had taken the risk of reaching out to him directly. The simple honesty of her message, the vulnerability she'd shown in admitting how deeply his small gesture had affected her, made something in his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Before he could second-guess himself, he typed back, "It didn't sound foolish. And you do matter, more than you know. Can we talk tomorrow? Same place, same time?" Her response came almost immediately. "I'd like that." Thunder crashed overhead as the first raindrops began to fall, but Demon barely noticed the approaching storm. For the first time since his grandfather's ultimatum, he felt something other than trapped resignation. Tomorrow, he would have another chance to step outside the carefully constructed role that defined his existence. Tomorrow, he could be himself, whoever that turned out to be, with someone who seemed to see possibilities in him that he'd never dared to imagine. The wind picked up, carrying with it the wild scent of approaching rain and something else, something that made his wolf lift its head and howl silently at the moon. Change was coming, riding the storm winds like an ancient prophecy finally ready to fulfill itself. As he walked back toward the mansion, Demon made a decision that would have horrified his grandfather and thrilled the part of himself he'd spent years learning to suppress. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, he was going to find out who he could become when he stopped trying to be who everyone expected him to be. The Harvest Moon celebration was still weeks away. The Morrison Alliance could wait. Tonight, for the first time in his life, Demon Blackthorn chose possibility over certainty, hope over duty. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. Chapter 3. The night everything changed. The months that followed their library encounter passed in a blur of stolen moments and carefully concealed meetings. Celeste and Demon found themselves gravitating toward each other like binary stars locked in an inevitable dance, always circling, always drawn together, always fighting the gravitational pull that threatened to consume them both. Their secret rendezvous became the highlight of Celeste's otherwise mundane existence. Sometimes they met in the abandoned astronomy tower, where dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight while they shared dreams and fears that had never been spoken aloud. Other times, they would find each other in the Academy's extensive gardens, walking among the ancient oaks while discussing everything from pack politics to their favorite books. Demon was nothing like the arrogant prince she'd imagined from afar. Away from the performance of his public persona, he revealed layers of complexity that fascinated and thrilled her. He was wickedly intelligent, with a dry sense of humor that could make her laugh until her ribs ached. He was also deeply conflicted about his future, torn between family loyalty and personal authenticity in ways that made her heart ache for the impossible position he'd been placed in since birth. "Sometimes I think about just disappearing," he confessed one afternoon as they sat beneath their favorite oak tree, its sprawling branches providing shelter from both prying eyes and autumn rain. "Taking nothing but the clothes on my back and walking until I find somewhere nobody knows the Blackthorn name." "And then what?" Celeste asked, studying his profile as he stared out at the Academy's grounds with an expression of barely contained longing. "Then I'd figure out who I really am when I'm not trying to live up to anyone else's expectations." He turned to look at her, and the vulnerability in his dark eyes made her breath catch. "Maybe I'd find work as a teacher, or a mechanic, or anything that lets me build something instead of just inheriting it. Maybe I'd fall in love with someone who chose me for myself rather than my bloodline." The weight of unspoken meaning in those words hung between them like a bridge neither quite dared to cross. They were from different worlds, literally different castes in the supernatural hierarchy, and acknowledging the growing attraction between them would complicate everything in ways that could destroy them both. But Luna whispered constantly in Celeste's mind now, recognizing something in Demon that her human consciousness wasn't quite ready to accept. "He's ours," her wolf insisted during the long nights when sleep eluded her and she replayed every conversation, every accidental touch, every moment when their eyes met and held just a beat too long. "Can't you feel it? Can't you sense what he is to us?" She could feel it, that electric current that seemed to arc between them whenever they were in the same room, the way her pulse quickened when she caught his scent in the hallways, the absolute rightness she experienced in his presence that made the rest of the world fade into background noise. But feeling it and acknowledging it were two very different things, and acknowledgement would mean accepting a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. The weeks turned into months, and their friendship deepened into something that defied easy categorization. They weren't quite lovers, but they were far more than friends. They existed in that liminal space between possibility and reality, sustained by stolen glances and conversations that revealed more about their true selves than either had ever shared with another soul. And then came the night of the Obsidian Tower Corporation's annual winter gala. The ballroom of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel had been transformed into something from a supernatural fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic rainbows across walls draped in midnight blue silk, while arrangements of white roses and silver branches created an atmosphere of elegant mystique. The guest list read like a who's who of supernatural society, alpha families from across the continent, business leaders whose companies shaped both human and wolf worlds, and political figures whose decisions affected pack territories from coast to coast. Celeste shouldn't have been there. Her invitation had arrived through mysterious circumstances, a formal card with her name written in elegant script, bearing the Blackthorn family seal and requesting her presence at the evening's festivities. She'd stared at it for nearly an hour, certain there had been some mistake, before her grandmother had found her sitting at their tiny kitchen table with tears streaming down her cheeks. "What's wrong, little wolf?" her grandmother had asked, settling into the chair beside her with the careful movements of someone whose bones carried the weight of 8 decades and more loss than any person should have to bear. "I don't belong there," Celeste had whispered, holding up the invitation like evidence of some cosmic joke. "This is for people with money and power and bloodlines that matter. I'm nobody." Her grandmother, a woman who had survived pack wars, the death of her mate, and decades of raising a granddaughter alone on a cleaning woman's salary, had taken the invitation and studied it with eyes that still held flashes of the fierce wolf she'd once been. "You're Isabel Rivers' granddaughter," she'd said firmly. Your bloodline may not appear in the pack registries or claim territory on any map, but it runs deeper and truer than half the families who'll be in that ballroom. You carry the strength of women who survived when survival seemed impossible, who loved when love was dangerous, who fought for their families with nothing but determination and fierce hearts. She stood then, moving to the small closet where she kept her most precious possessions, and emerged with a dress bag that Celeste had never seen before. "This belonged to your mother," her grandmother had said, her voice thick with emotion. "She never got the chance to wear it, but I hope someday you might have an occasion worthy of it." The dress was breathtaking, deep emerald silk that seemed to capture and hold light like liquid magic, with a classic silhouette that spoke of timeless elegance rather than fleeting fashion. When Celeste put it on, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. The girl who stared back at her looked sophisticated, confident, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with supernatural hierarchies and everything to do with the kind of inner strength that couldn't be taught or inherited. "You belong anywhere you choose to be," her grandmother had said, fastening a simple strand of pearls around Celeste's neck. "Don't let anyone tell you differently." Now, standing in the hotel's opulent lobby as waves of supernatural elite swept past her toward the ballroom, Celeste felt her confidence wavering. The dress that had made her feel like royalty in her grandmother's modest apartment now seemed woefully inadequate among the designer gowns and glittering jewelry that surrounded her. She clutched her small purse like a lifeline and tried to remember her grandmother's words about belonging anywhere she chose to be. Celeste. She turned at the sound of her name and felt her breath catch in her throat. Demon stood a few feet away, resplendent in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that emphasized his tall frame and broad shoulders. His dark hair was swept back from his face, revealing the sharp angles and elegant bones that marked him as unmistakably Blackthorn. But it was his eyes, those beautiful, complex eyes that had seen past her awkward exterior to glimpse something worth knowing, that made her heart race. "You came," he said, and she could hear genuine surprise and pleasure in his voice. "I got an invitation," she replied, still somewhat bewildered by the turn of events. "I'm not entirely sure how or why, but you're here." He moved closer, and she caught his scent, cedar and smoke with that underlying wildness that never failed to make Luna stir restlessly in her mind. "You look." He paused, his gaze traveling from her carefully styled hair to the emerald silk that transformed her from invisible academy student to someone who belonged in ballrooms and fairy tales. "You look absolutely stunning." Heat flooded her cheeks at the compliment, made all the more powerful by the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." He laughed, a sound of genuine amusement that reminded her why she'd fallen so completely under his spell. "My grandfather would be horrified to hear his heir described as cleaning up pretty well, but I'll take it as the highest compliment." "Speaking of your grandfather," Celeste said, suddenly aware of the curious glances they were attracting from other guests, "should we be concerned about being seen together? I don't want to cause problems for you." Something shifted in Demon's expression, a flash of irritation that was quickly suppressed but not quite hidden. "Let me worry about my grandfather. Tonight, I'd like to focus on something more pleasant." He offered her his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. "Would you do me the honor of being my escort for the evening? I promise to keep you entertained and adequately supplied with champagne and those little appetizers that are too small to actually constitute food." The formal phrasing made her smile, but beneath his light tone she could sense genuine nervousness. This wasn't just a casual invitation. By asking her to be his official escort, he was making a statement that would be noticed and analyzed by everyone in attendance. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "I don't want you to do something you'll regret, Celeste." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to rest gently on her shoulders. "The only thing I would regret is wasting this opportunity to spend an entire evening with you without having to hide or make excuses or pretend we're just casual acquaintances." The warmth in his voice and the tender way he looked at her made something in her chest flutter, like caged wings finally being set free. "In that case," she said, slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow, "I would be honored to be your escort." The ballroom was a wonderland of supernatural society at its most glittering and dangerous. Celeste found herself introduced to alpha families whose names she'd only heard whispered in reverent tones, business moguls whose decisions shaped the economies of entire regions, and political figures whose influence extended far beyond the supernatural community. To her amazement, she found herself not just surviving these encounters, but actually enjoying them. The years she'd spent feeling invisible had given her excellent observational skills, and her genuine curiosity about people and their stories made her a better conversationalist than she'd ever imagined. More than once, she caught Demon watching her with an expression of proud amazement as she charmed his grandfather's associates and held her own in discussions about everything from pack politics to technological innovation. "You're full of surprises," he murmured during a brief lull between introductions. "I should have known that someone who could hold her own with Madison Cross wouldn't be intimidated by a few alpha patriarchs." "The secret," Celeste confided, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing server, "is remembering that underneath all the power and posturing, they're still just people. They want to feel heard and interesting and important. Give them that, and they'll forgive almost any breach of protocol." Spoken like someone who understands the fundamental nature of power, Demon said, his admiration clear in his voice. "You're going to make an incredible—" He stopped abruptly, his expression shifting as he realized what he'd been about to say. The unfinished sentence hung between them like a question neither was quite ready to answer. What an incredible thing, Celeste wondered. Mate? Partner? Luna? Before either of them could address the moment, they were interrupted by the arrival of Magnus Blackthorne himself. The family patriarch moved through the ballroom like a shark through water, elegant, dangerous, and absolutely in command of his environment. He was taller than Demon, with a kind of presence that made even powerful alphas step aside to clear his path. His silver hair gleamed under the chandeliers, and his ice-blue eyes missed nothing as they swept over his grandson and his unexpected companion. "Demon," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate attention and obedience. "I've been looking for you. There are several people I'd like you to meet." His gaze shifted to Celeste, and she felt like a specimen being examined under a microscope. There was no hostility in his expression, but there was a calculating coldness that made her wolf retreat deeper into her consciousness, recognizing a predator far more dangerous than anything they'd ever encountered. "And you must be Miss Rivers," Magnus continued, offering her a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "How unexpected to see you here this evening, Mr. Blackthorne." Celeste managed to keep her voice steady despite the way her pulse was racing. "Thank you for including me in your guest list. The gala is absolutely beautiful." His non-committal response suggested he knew perfectly well he hadn't been responsible for her invitation, but was choosing not to address the discrepancy publicly. "I hope you're enjoying yourself. Demon, the Riverside delegation has arrived, and Alpha Morrison is particularly eager to introduce you to his daughter." The reminder of the arranged marriage hit like a physical blow. Celeste felt the blood drain from her face as the implications crashed over her. This wasn't just a pleasant evening with someone she cared about. It was potentially the last time she would ever have him to herself before duty and family expectations claimed him completely. "Of course," Demon said, his voice carefully neutral. "I'll be alone shortly." "Sooner rather than later would be preferable," Magnus said, his tone making it clear that this wasn't a request. "The Morrison alliance represents a significant opportunity for our family's continued prosperity." He nodded politely to Celeste and glided away, leaving behind the kind of uncomfortable silence that follows barely veiled threats. "I should go," Celeste said quietly, setting down her champagne glass with hands that trembled only slightly. "I don't want to keep you from your obligations." "Celeste, wait." Demon caught her arm as she started to turn away. "It's not what you think. The arrangement with Valentina, it's just politics. It doesn't mean anything. Doesn't it?" She looked up at him, searching his face for some sign that he was prepared to fight for what was growing between them. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like it means everything. Your entire future, your family's approval, your position in the pack hierarchy." "You're right," he said after a long moment, his honesty more devastating than any lie could have been. It does mean all of those things. But that doesn't mean it's what I want. The admission hung between them like a confession, raw and vulnerable and completely inadequate to change their circumstances. What we want doesn't seem to matter much, does it? Celeste said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded when everything inside her was screaming. You have responsibilities, expectations, a future that was planned before you were even born.
And I
was foolish to think that anything between us could survive in the real world. Don't say that. His grip on her arm tightened, desperate and possessive. What we have is real, Celeste. It's the most real thing in my life. But it's not enough, is it? The question emerged with devastating clarity. Being real isn't enough when you're fighting against centuries of tradition and family expectation and pack law. Before he could respond, the music shifted to a waltz, and couples began moving toward the dance floor. Celeste watched as a stunning young woman with auburn hair and perfect posture glided through the crowd toward them, flanked by what were obviously her parents and several other pack dignitaries. Valentina Morrison was everything Celeste was not, poised where she was awkward, confident where she was uncertain, born to the kind of privilege and position that made claiming Demon Blackthorn seem as natural as breathing. She's beautiful, Celeste said quietly and meant it. She's perfect, Demon replied, his voice heavy with resignation. Perfect bloodline, perfect education, perfect training in pack politics and supernatural diplomacy. She'll make an excellent alpha's mate and produce beautiful, powerful children who will continue the Blackthorn legacy for generations. The clinical way he described his future bride made something inside Celeste crack like ice under pressure. And what about love? Love is a luxury that people like me can't afford. The words sounded rehearsed, as if he'd been telling himself the same thing for years. My grandfather made that very clear after my parents died. Personal desires lead to weakness. Weakness leads to mistakes, and mistakes can destroy everything our family has built. Your parents loved each other, Celeste said, remembering stories she'd heard whispered around the academy about the great romantic tragedy of the previous Blackthorn generation. And look how that ended. Pain flashed across his features before being quickly suppressed. They died because they put personal happiness above strategic thinking. My grandfather won't let me repeat their mistakes. Valentina Morrison was close enough now that Celeste could see the subtle calculations happening behind her perfectly applied makeup. This was a woman who had been raised for one purpose, to be the perfect alpha's mate, and she wore that purpose like armor. Dance with me, Demon said suddenly urgently. Before I have to go play the dutiful grandson, dance with me. Let me have one perfect moment to remember when everything else goes to hell. The request was selfish and impossible and completely unfair to everyone involved. Dancing with him now would only make the inevitable goodbye more painful, would give her one more memory to torture herself with during the long nights ahead. She took his offered hand anyway. The waltz was a dance made for lovers, intimate and graceful, requiring trust and synchronization that went deeper than mere physical coordination. Demon's hand at her waist burned through the silk of her dress, while his other hand engulfed hers with a warmth that seemed to travel straight to her heart. They moved together as if they'd been dancing for years rather than minutes, their bodies finding a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. I need to tell you something, Demon said quietly as he spun her through the elaborate pattern of the dance. Something I should have said weeks ago. Don't. The word emerged as a whisper, barely audible above the music. Whatever it is, don't say it. It will only make this harder. I'm falling in love with you. The words hit her like lightning, illuminating everything she'd been trying to hide from herself. The way her heart raced whenever he was near, the way she felt most like herself when she was with him, the way her wolf recognized him as something precious and essential and completely right.
Demon.
I know it's impossible, he continued, guiding her through a turn that brought them closer together. I know it complicates everything and solves nothing. But I needed you to know before everything changes. Tears blurred her vision, turning the ballroom into a kaleidoscope of light and color. I'm falling in love with you too, she whispered. I have been for months. And it's terrifying and wonderful and completely hopeless. They finished the dance in silence, both lost in the bittersweet perfection of a moment they knew they could never reclaim. When the music ended, they stood in the center of the dance floor with their hands still joined and their eyes locked on each other's faces, memorizing details against the long separation ahead. Mr. Blackthorn? Valentina Morrison's voice was cultured and pleasant, with just a hint of curiosity about the young woman who had been monopolizing her intended mate's attention. I believe our parents are hoping we might share a dance. The spell broke like crystal hitting stone. Demon's hands fell away from Celeste's body, and she stepped back with a smile that felt like it might crack her face in half. Of course, Demon said, his voice automatically shifting into the polite, charming tone he used for pack politics. Miss Morrison, may I present Miss Celeste Rivers? Celeste, this is Valentina Morrison of the Riverside Pack. How lovely to meet you, Valentina said with a kind of gracious politeness that spoke of excellent breeding and careful training. Are you enjoying the gala? Very much, Celeste managed, proud of how steady her voice remained. It's been enlightening. Something flickered in Valentina's perfectly composed expression, a flash of understanding that suggested she was more perceptive than her polished exterior indicated. I'm sure it has been. If you'll excuse us, I believe Demon promised me a dance. It was a dismissal couched in courtesy, delivered with just enough warmth to avoid being overtly rude. Celeste recognized the skill involved and found herself grudgingly respecting the other woman's political acumen even as her heart broke into 1,000 pieces. Of course, she said, stepping aside with as much dignity as she could muster. Enjoy your evening. She made it to the ladies' room before the tears started falling in earnest. 20 minutes later, Celeste emerged from the marble-appointed powder room with her composure restored and her resolve crystallized. She'd made a decision while staring at her reflection in the ornate mirror, watching tears streak down cheeks that were too pale and eyes that held too much heartbreak for someone barely 18. She was leaving. Tonight. Not just the gala, but the academy, the pack territory, everything that connected her to Demon Blackthorn and the impossible dream of a future together. Her grandmother had been right. She belonged anywhere she chose to be. And she was choosing to be somewhere that didn't require her to watch the man she loved marry someone else for the sake of pack politics and family expectations. She retrieved her coat from the check and made her way toward the hotel's main entrance, planning to call a taxi and disappear into the night like Cinderella fleeing the ball. She'd made it halfway across the lobby when a familiar voice stopped her in her tracks. Leaving so soon? Magnus Blackthorn stood beside one of the marble pillars that supported the lobby's soaring ceiling, looking like he'd been waiting for her to make exactly this choice. His ice-blue eyes held none of the calculation she'd seen earlier. Instead, there was something that might have been sympathy, if such an emotion were possible from someone of his reputation. The evening has been educational, Celeste said carefully, but I think it's time for me to go. Indeed. He moved closer, his presence somehow less intimidating than it had been earlier. Before you leave, I wonder if I might have a word. There's a quiet bar just off the lobby where we could speak privately. Every instinct screamed at her to politely decline and flee while she still could. Nothing good could come from a private conversation with Magnus Blackthorn, especially not tonight when her emotional defenses were in tatters. But curiosity won out over caution, and she found herself nodding. Of course. The bar was intimate and dimly lit, with leather banquettes and the kind of aged whiskey selection that spoke to serious drinking rather than casual socializing. Magnus selected a corner table that offered privacy from other patrons and ordered 2 glasses of what Celeste suspected was extremely expensive bourbon. You're wondering why I arranged for your invitation tonight, he said without preamble, settling back in his chair with a kind of relaxed authority that suggested he was accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment. Celeste nearly choked on her bourbon. You sent the invitation? I did. His smile was enigmatic, revealing nothing of his motivations. I wanted to observe the dynamic between you and my grandson more natural setting. And what did you observe? The question emerged with more boldness than wisdom, but she was beyond caring about proper protocol with powerful alphas. I observed a young woman of considerable intelligence and surprising poise who has managed to capture my grandson's attention in ways that concern me greatly. The brutal honesty made her flinch. I see. Do you? Magnus leaned forward, his gaze intensifying. Because I'm not certain you understand the full implications of what's developing between you and Demon. I understand that he's engaged to Valentina Morrison, Celeste said quietly. I understand that your family has expectations and obligations that don't include someone of my background. And I understand that whatever feelings exist between us can't survive in the real world of pack politics and supernatural hierarchy. All true, Magnus agreed. But you're missing the most important point. He paused to sip his bourbon, apparently in no hurry to deliver whatever devastating revelation he had planned. My grandson is not merely attracted to you, Miss Rivers. He's falling in love with you in ways that threaten everything I've spent decades building. The confirmation of what she'd already suspected shouldn't have hit so hard, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly by the one person who had the power to destroy any future they might dream of together made the reality inescapable. I know, she whispered. Do you also know that the Morrison alliance represents more than just a politically advantageous marriage? Valentina's bloodline carries genetic markers that could strengthen the Blackthorn pack for generations. Her family's territory controls shipping lanes that are essential to our business operations. Her father's political connections could influence legislation that affects every supernatural pack in North America. Each word was a nail in the coffin of her impossible dreams. I understand the practical benefits. I wonder if you do. Magnus' voice carried a note of something that might have been respected. Because despite all of those advantages, despite years of careful planning and negotiation, despite the very real consequences of abandoning the Morrison alliance, my grandson spent this entire evening looking at you as if you were the only person in the room. Celeste stared at him, trying to process what felt like the most complicated emotional manipulation she'd ever encountered. What do you want from me? I want you to disappear. The blunt statement hit like a physical blow, even though she'd been expecting something of the sort. Not because I dislike you personally, Magnus continued, his tone almost conversational. In fact, under different circumstances, I might have been pleased to welcome someone of your obvious intelligence and strength into our family. But circumstances are what they are, and I cannot allow personal feelings to jeopardize everything the Blackthorn name represents. So, you want me to just leave? Disappear without explanation? I want you to make a choice that prioritizes Demon's future over your own desires. His ice blue eyes bored into hers with surgical precision. I want you to love him enough to let him fulfill his destiny without the constant temptation of what might have been. The twisted logic made her stomach turn even as she recognized the grain of truth buried within the manipulation. If she stayed, she would become a constant source of conflict between Demon and his family obligations. Her very existence would be a reminder of the path not taken, the love sacrificed for duty. And if I refuse? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Magnus' smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Then you'll discover exactly how far a determined alpha patriarch will go to protect his family's interests. Your grandmother's job, your academy scholarship, your family's continued residence in pack territory. All of these things exist at the sufferance of those with power. The threat was delivered with such casual elegance that it took a moment for the full implications to sink in. He wasn't just asking her to disappear. He was making it clear that her refusal would have consequences for everyone she loved. You're asking me to break both our hearts to protect your political alliance. I'm asking you to make an adult decision about competing priorities. Magnus finished his bourbon and set the glass down with a soft clink that sounded like a gavel ending a trial. Love is a luxury, Miss Rivers. Power is a necessity. Demon will recover from heartbreak. He's been trained for resilience since childhood. He will not recover from the destruction of everything his family has built. Celeste sat in the leather banquette, staring at her hands while her world reorganized itself around this new reality. Everything she'd thought she understood about her relationship with Demon, every hopeful dream she'd allowed herself to nurture, crumbled like castles built on sand. How long do I have? She asked finally. I'd prefer you be gone before morning. Magnus stood, straightening his jacket with the same precision he applied to every aspect of his perfectly controlled life. There's an envelope on your table with sufficient funds for relocation and a fresh start elsewhere. Consider it a graduation gift. She looked down to find a thick manila envelope that definitely hadn't been there when they sat down. The man's ability to orchestrate events down to the smallest detail was both impressive and terrifying. Will you tell him? The question emerged as barely a whisper. That his grandfather threatened the woman he loves into disappearing? I think not. Magnus paused at the edge of their secluded corner. I'll allow him to believe you made your own choice. It's kinder that way. Kinder for whom? For both of you in the long run. Resentment toward family is corrosive. Better he believe you didn't care enough to fight for him than spend years hating the man who raised him. The psychology was as twisted as it was effective. Even in exile, she would be protecting Demon from the full knowledge of what his family was capable of when their interests were threatened. You're a monster, she said quietly, the words carrying no heat, just weary recognition of the truth. I'm a patriarch who understands the price of survival in a world that shows no mercy to the weak or sentimental. Magnus Blackthorne moved toward the bar's exit with the fluid grace of a predator returning to his territory. Safe travels, Miss Rivers. I trust we won't meet again. After he left, Celeste sat alone in the dimly lit bar, staring at the envelope that represented both her salvation and her destruction. Inside would be enough money to disappear completely, to start over somewhere far from the supernatural community and its brutal hierarchies. She thought about Demon, probably still dancing with Valentina Morrison while trying to hide his heartbreak behind the charming mask he wore so well. She thought about her grandmother, asleep in their small apartment, trusting that her granddaughter was having the magical evening every young woman deserved. She thought about Luna, who had fallen silent in her mind, her wolf spirit retreating into the deepest recesses of her consciousness to mourn the mate bond that would never be allowed to fully form. Outside the hotel, snow had begun to fall, covering the city in a blanket of pristine white that made everything look clean and new and full of possibility. Celeste pulled her coat tighter around herself and raised her hand to signal a taxi. She didn't look back at the golden windows of the ballroom where her heart was dancing with another woman, learning to love someone safe and appropriate and destined to bear his children. Some stories, she realized, weren't meant to have happy endings. Some loves were too dangerous, too costly, too destructive to the established order to survive in anything but memory. But as the taxi pulled away from the hotel and carried her toward an uncertain future, Celeste allowed herself one last moment of defiant hope. Maybe Magnus Blackthorne was right about power and necessity and the price of survival. Or maybe, just maybe, love was stronger than all of those things combined. Only time would tell. Chapter 4. Years of Silence. 5 years. 5 years, 3 months, and 17 days had passed since Celeste Rivers walked out of that hotel and disappeared into the anonymous sprawl of Miami's supernatural underground. She counted the time not in celebration of survival, but as a prisoner might mark days on a cell wall, each one a testament to endurance rather than living. The Southern Sanctuary had welcomed her without questions, as such places always did for wolves fleeing circumstances too dangerous or shameful to name. Here, among the cypress trees and Spanish moss, among wolves whose own stories were written in scars and silence, she had learned that survival was its own form of strength. The boarding house where she'd taken residence sat on the edge of the Everglades, where civilization blurred into something wilder and more honest than the polished territories she'd left behind. Her room was small, barely large enough for a single bed, a dresser, and the tiny desk where she spent her evenings working on freelance coding projects that paid just enough to keep her fed and sheltered. She'd learned to live quietly, to take up as little space as possible in a world that seemed determined to forget she existed. The girl who had once dreamed of changing the supernatural world through technology had become someone who fixed other people's broken websites and debugged corporate software for companies that would never know her name. But it wasn't survival that defined these years. It was the secret she carried, growing within her like a star being born in the depths of space. Phoenix. She'd named him for the mythical bird that rose from ashes, because that's what he represented. New life emerging from the ruins of everything she'd thought she wanted. The night she'd discovered her pregnancy, 3 weeks after fleeing New York, she'd sat on the narrow bed in her boarding house room and wept until there were no tears left. Not from sorrow, though grief for her lost love was a constant ache in her chest, but from the overwhelming recognition that she carried within her the most precious gift the universe could bestow. A child conceived from love, even if that love had been deemed impossible by those who claimed to understand the way the world should work. Phoenix Blackthorn Rivers, though he would never carry his father's name officially. For years old now, with his father's midnight hair that refused to lie flat no matter how carefully she combed it, and Demon's dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to the heart of things. But he had her stubborn chin and her curiosity about the world, her questions that never seemed to end, and her fierce protectiveness toward anything smaller or weaker than himself. "Mama," Phoenix said now, tugging on the hem of her worn sundress as she stood at the kitchen counter, stirring honey into their breakfast oatmeal. "Mrs. Moonwhisper says I can help her with the bread today, if you say it's okay." Celeste looked down at her son. This miracle child who had never known anything but her love and the strange, makeshift family they'd created among the other displaced souls of the Southern Sanctuary. Mrs. Moonwhisper was the ancient healer who ran the boarding house, a wolf so old her human form bore the silver hair and knowing eyes of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of entire pack dynasties. "Did you finish your reading practice?" Celeste asked, smoothing down the cowlick that made Phoenix's hair stick up at impossible angles. "Yes, Mama. I read the whole book about the dragon who is afraid of his own fire." Phoenix's face scrunched into the serious expression he wore when tackling complex thoughts. Why was he scared of something that was part of him? The question hit closer to home than her 4-year-old could possibly know. "Sometimes," Celeste said carefully, "we're afraid of the parts of ourselves that seem too powerful or too different." The dragon had to learn that his fire wasn't dangerous. It was what made him special. Phoenix nodded with the grave acceptance that children show when adults try to explain the inexplicable complexities of existence. "Like how I'm different from the other kids because I don't have a daddy?" The innocent question was a knife between her ribs. Phoenix asked about his father regularly, with the persistent curiosity of a child who sensed there was a story being kept from him. She developed a careful repertoire of responses, that his daddy lived far away, that sometimes grown-ups had to make hard choices, that love was complicated but never wrong. All true in their way. None of them are adequate to explain why his father didn't know he existed. "Your daddy is..." She paused, choosing words that wouldn't become lies as Phoenix grew older and the truth became harder to avoid. "Your daddy is a good man who lives in a world very different from ours. Sometimes good people have to make choices that keep the people they love safe, even if those choices mean they can't be together." "Is that why we live here instead of with him?" "That's part of it, yes." Phoenix considered this with the gravity of a child who had learned early that the world was more complicated than fairy tales suggested. "Will I meet him someday?" The question that haunted her dreams and waking hours alike. "I don't know, little wolf. Maybe someday when you're older, you can decide if you want to find him." "I think I'd like that," Phoenix said with a confident certainty that only 4-year-olds could muster. "I bet he's tall like the men in Mrs. Moonwhisper stories. I bet he's brave and strong, and he fights monsters." "He is," Celeste thought, her heart clenching with familiar pain. "He's all of those things and more. And if he knew you existed, he would move heaven and earth to be part of your life." "Go help Mrs. Moonwhisper with the bread," she said instead, pressing a kiss to the top of Phoenix's unruly head. "But remember to listen carefully to her instructions. Bread making is serious magic." Phoenix giggled and scampered out of their tiny kitchen, his energy and joy filling the small space even after he left. Celeste finished preparing their breakfast and sat at the wobbly table that served as desk, dining room, and craft center, staring out the window at the morning mist rising from the swamps. 5 years, 3 months, and 17 days. She wondered if Demon ever thought about that night at the gala. If he remembered the way she'd felt in his arms during their single dance, or if the demands of his new life had gradually overwritten those memories with more practical concerns. He'd married Valentina Morrison 6 months after Celeste's disappearance. She'd seen the announcement in the Supernatural Society pages of a magazine someone had left in the boarding house's common area, a photograph of the happy couple leaving their wedding ceremony, surrounded by packed dignitaries and business associates. Demon had looked handsome and composed in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, while Valentina glowed with the satisfaction of a woman who had achieved exactly what she'd been raised to accomplish. The article had mentioned their plans to modernize the Blackthorn business empire, their commitment to strengthening pack alliances across the northeastern territories, and their intention to start a family that would carry on both bloodlines with appropriate honor and distinction. She'd torn the page from the magazine and burned it that night, watching their perfect smiles curl into ash while Phoenix slept peacefully in his crib, unaware that his father was building a new life with another woman. There had been no other announcements since then. No birth notices for Blackthorn heirs, no society photographs of Demon and Valentina at pack functions with children in tow. Sometimes, in her weaker moments, Celeste found herself wondering if the Morrison marriage had produced the powerful offspring that Magnus Blackthorn had been so determined to secure. She told herself it didn't matter. That chapter of her life was closed, sealed away like a book she could never afford to reopen. She had Phoenix now, and their small but genuine community in the Southern Sanctuary, and work that kept them fed and sheltered, if not prosperous. It was enough. It had to be enough. Her laptop chimed with an incoming email, another freelance project, probably, or a client with questions about the website she'd delivered last week. But when she opened her inbox, the sender's name made her blood freeze in her veins. Urban Tech Solutions, Miami branch. The company name meant nothing to her, but the email signature at the bottom of the message made her hands shake as she read. Marcus Chun, HR Director on behalf of Obsidian Tower Corporation. The message itself was professional, almost mundane, an offer for a full-time position as senior software developer with their Miami development team, salary and benefits that would change her entire life, start date flexible to accommodate her current situation. But at the very bottom, below the corporate letterhead and legal disclaimers, was a single line that made her heart stop. Some opportunities are worth the risk. She stared at the screen for a long time, her mind racing through possibilities and implications. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone who knew her history, her connection to the Blackthorn family, had arranged for this offer to find its way to her. The question was whether that someone was offering her a genuine chance at a better life or setting a trap that would destroy the precarious safety she'd built for herself and Phoenix. Mama. Phoenix's voice carried from the kitchen, high-pitched with excitement. Mrs. Moonwhisper says I'm the best bread helper she's ever had. She says I have magic hands. The innocent joy in her son's voice anchored her to the present moment. Whatever game was being played, whatever forces were moving behind the scenes to draw her back into a world she'd fled, her first priority had to be Phoenix's safety and happiness. But the offer was generous enough to give them options she'd never dared to dream about. Real health insurance instead of the sliding scale clinic visits they currently relied on. A savings account for Phoenix's education. Maybe even a small house instead of their cramped boarding house room. Most importantly, it was work in her actual field. Challenging, meaningful projects that would use her skills and education instead of the endless parade of small fixes and maintenance tasks that paid the bills but left her intellectually starved. She read the email 3 more times, looking for hidden meanings and unstated expectations. The position was real. She recognized the projects they described from her research into cutting-edge software development. The salary was fair, even generous by Miami standards. The benefits package was comprehensive enough to suggest a company that actually valued its employees. Everything about the offer was exactly what she'd been hoping to find for years, which was precisely what made it so suspicious. Her phone rang, interrupting her analysis of potential motives and hidden agendas. The number was local but unfamiliar. Hello, Miss Rivers? The voice was professionally warm, with the kind of careful diction that suggested expensive education and corporate training. This is Marcus Chun from Urban Tech Solutions. I hope you received our email regarding the senior developer position. Her pulse jumped. I did, just a few minutes ago. Excellent. I know it's short notice, but would you be available to come in for an interview this afternoon? I realize that's not standard protocol, but we're eager to fill this position quickly, and your qualifications are exactly what we're looking for. The pressure tactics were subtle, but unmistakable. Create urgency, suggest she was uniquely qualified, make the opportunity seem scarce, and therefore more valuable. Classic recruitment strategies, but that didn't make them any less effective. I'd need to arrange childcare, she said carefully. I have a 4-year-old son. Of course. Would 2 o'clock work? Our office is downtown, near the financial district. I can email you the address and parking information. She found herself agreeing before her rational mind could catalog all the reasons this was potentially dangerous. Marcus Chen's voice carried genuine enthusiasm that was hard to fake, and the prospect of intellectual challenge and financial stability was too tempting to dismiss without at least exploring the possibility. After hanging up, she sat in the morning sunlight streaming through their small window, trying to decide if she was making the smartest decision of her life or the most foolish. Mrs. Moonwhisper, she called, knowing the ancient wolf's supernatural hearing would catch her words even from the kitchen. Would you mind watching Phoenix this afternoon? I have a job interview. The reply came laden with knowing amusement. About time, child. That boy needs more opportunities than this old sanctuary can provide, and you need work that feeds your mind as well as your belly. It was true, though Celeste hadn't realized how transparent her restlessness had become. Phoenix was growing, developing the kind of sharp intelligence that would require educational opportunities the Southern Sanctuary couldn't offer. And she was withering intellectually, slowly losing herself to the grinding routine of survival rather than living. Maybe this mysterious job offer was exactly what it appeared to be, a chance for something better. Maybe Marcus Chun was simply an efficient HR director who had identified her skills through normal recruiting channels. Or maybe Magnus Blackthorne had finally decided that 5 years was long enough for his grandson to forget his first love, and it was time to eliminate the last loose end that might threaten the perfect life he'd constructed for the Blackthorne heir. Either way, she was going to find out. She spent the morning helping Phoenix with his reading and playing the elaborate fantasy games that kept his active mind occupied, but part of her attention remained fixed on the afternoon ahead. She chose her interview outfit carefully. Professional but not expensive, confident but not threatening, and practiced answers to questions about the gap in her employment history. I took time off to focus on family responsibilities sounded better than I fled in terror from your parent company's CEO and spent 5 years hiding in the supernatural equivalent of witness protection. At 1:30, she kissed Phoenix goodbye and borrowed Mrs. Moonwhisper's ancient Honda for the drive into Miami's gleaming downtown core. Urban Tech Solutions occupied 3 floors of a glass tower that reflected the afternoon sun like a mirror, surrounded by the kind of corporate architecture that spoke to serious money and ambitious plans. The lobby was all marble and chrome, with the hushed efficiency of a well-oiled machine designed to impress clients and intimidate competitors. Celeste gave her name to the receptionist, a polished young wolf whose smile never wavered as she checked computer screens and made quiet phone calls. Mr. Chin will see you now, the receptionist said, gesturing toward a bank of elevators. 23rd floor, suite 2340. The elevator ride gave her a few more minutes to compose herself and review her strategy. Be professional but not desperate. Express interest but maintain some leverage. Ask intelligent questions about the work while avoiding any topic that might lead back to her connection with the Blackthorne family. Marcus Chen's office was smaller than she'd expected, with the lived-in feel of someone who actually worked there rather than just conducting interviews. His desk was covered with project documents and technical manuals, while white boards along the walls showed evidence of collaborative planning sessions and problem-solving marathons. The man himself was perhaps 40, with a kind of quiet competence that suggested he'd earned his position through skill rather than politics. He stood when she entered, offering a firm handshake and a smile that seemed genuinely pleased rather than professionally manufactured. Miss Rivers, thank you for coming on such short notice. Please have a seat. He gestured to one of two chairs arranged in front of his desk. Can I offer you coffee or water? Water would be great. Thank you. He poured from a pitcher on a side table, giving her a moment to study his office more carefully. The technical manuals were current, the project documents looked legitimate, and the whiteboards contained the kind of complex problem-solving work that couldn't be faked by someone unfamiliar with actual software development. Whatever else this was, Urban Tech Solutions appeared to be a real company doing real work. I'll be honest, Marcus said, settling back in his chair with his own glass of water. Your resume is exactly what we've been looking for, but your recent work history raises some questions. Freelance projects are valuable experience, but we're curious about why someone with your qualifications hasn't pursued full-time employment in your field. The question she'd been dreading, delivered with a kind of diplomatic directness that suggested he already knew the answer was complicated. I've been focusing on family responsibilities, she said, sticking to her prepared response. My son needed stability and attention during his early years, and freelance work allowed me to provide that while maintaining my technical skills. Understandable. Many of our best employees are parents who've made similar choices. His tone suggested genuine respect rather than the patronizing understanding she'd encountered from other potential employers. But you're ready for full-time work now? I am. My son is old enough for regular daycare, and I'm eager to take on more challenging projects than freelance work typically provides. Marcus nodded, making notes on a legal pad. Let's talk about the technical side. We're developing applications that interface with both human and supernatural business systems, financial software for companies that operate in both worlds, communication platforms that can handle the unique security requirements of packed territories, that sort of thing. The work sounded exactly like the kind of complex, meaningful projects she dreamed about during the long nights of debugging corporate websites and fixing database problems for small businesses. That sounds fascinating, she said, allowing some of her genuine enthusiasm to show. I imagine the security challenges alone would be considerable, given the different legal frameworks and privacy requirements involved. Exactly. Marcus leaned forward, his expression shifting into the focused intensity of someone discussing work they truly cared about. We need developers who understand both technical excellence and the cultural nuances of supernatural business practices. Someone who can write code that works flawlessly while respecting traditions that go back centuries. They spent the next hour discussing technical challenges, project timelines, and the collaborative culture Marcus was trying to build within the development team. The conversation flowed naturally, with a kind of intellectual excitement that reminded Celeste why she'd fallen in love with software development in the first place. I have to ask, Marcus said as the interview wound toward its conclusion, are you familiar with Obsidian Tower Corporation? We're a subsidiary company, and there may be some cross-training opportunities with their development teams. The question hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the revelation that would expose whatever game was really being played. I'm familiar with the company name, she said carefully. They have an impressive reputation in both supernatural and human business communities. They do. Marcus watched her with a kind of careful attention that suggested he was evaluating more than just her technical qualifications. In fact, our parent company specifically requested that we prioritize candidates with strong backgrounds in supernatural business applications. Your experience makes you an ideal fit for our needs. Your experience. The phrase could mean her technical skills, her educational background, or her intimate familiarity with one of Obsidian Tower's most prominent executives. The ambiguity was almost certainly deliberate. I'm flattered by your confidence in my qualifications, Celeste said, maintaining her professional composure while her mind raced through implications and possibilities. There's one more thing. Marcus reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a sealed envelope bearing her name in elegant script. This arrived for you this morning, along with instructions to deliver it only if our interview went well. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the paper stock and formal presentation suggested someone with both resources and a flair for dramatic gestures. Should I? She gestured toward the envelope.
Please.
I'll give you a moment of privacy. Marcus stepped out of his office, closing the door behind him with the kind of discretion that spoke to experience with unusual situations. Celeste waited until his footsteps faded before carefully opening the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper bearing just a few lines in the same elegant script. Asterisk Ms. Rivers. You have built a good life for yourself and your son in the years since our last meeting. However, circumstances have changed and opportunities have arisen that may benefit both of you considerably. If you are interested in exploring possibilities that seemed impossible 5 years ago, accept the position with Urban Tech Solutions. The work is genuine, the compensation fair, and the location chosen specifically to provide options you did not previously have. Some cages, once opened, cannot be closed again. But some freedoms, once tasted, make any cage unbearable. The choice, as always, is yours. A friend asterisk. She read the note 3 times before the implications fully registered. Someone who knew about her conversation with Magnus Blackthorne 5 years ago, someone who understood exactly why she'd fled and what she'd been hiding from, was offering her a way back into the world she'd abandoned. But was it a rescue or a trap? Marcus's soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Miss Rivers? Is everything all right? She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her purse before opening the door. Yes, sorry. Just processing some unexpected information. His expression was sympathetic without being intrusive. Sometimes opportunities come with complications. The important thing is making decisions that align with your priorities. Mr. Chun, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice, if I accepted this position, when would you need me to start? As soon as you're available. We understand that relocating with a child takes time, so we're flexible about timing. We can also provide relocation assistance if needed. The practical considerations were falling into place with suspicious ease. Generous salary, flexible start date, relocation assistance for a move she wasn't sure she wanted to make. Someone had clearly thought through every obstacle and arranged to eliminate it. I'll need to think about this, she said finally. It's a significant decision, and I have responsibilities to consider. Of course. Take whatever time you need. Marcus stood and extended his hand. But I hope you'll seriously consider joining our team. I think you'd find the work both challenging and rewarding. The drive back to the Southern Sanctuary passed in a blur of competing thoughts and emotions. Phoenix was waiting for her in the boarding house's common room, covered in flour and beaming with pride at the bread he'd helped create. Mrs. Moonwhisper watched from her rocking chair with the knowing eyes of someone who had seen this particular story play out before. How did it go, child? The ancient wolf asked as Celeste sank into the chair beside her. Complicated, Celeste replied, watching Phoenix show off his bread-making accomplishments to anyone willing to listen. Very, very complicated. The best opportunities usually are. Mrs. Moonwhisper's weathered hands continued their steady rhythm with her knitting needles. The question isn't whether it's complicated. The question is whether it's worth the complication. That night, after Phoenix had fallen asleep with flour still under his fingernails and dreams of becoming a master baker, Celeste sat at her tiny desk and stared at the mysterious note that had turned her carefully constructed world upside down. Some cages, once opened, cannot be closed again. She thought about Demon, wondered if he ever stood at the windows of his family mansion, and remembered a girl who had loved him enough to disappear rather than destroy his future. She wondered if Valentina had given him children, if he'd learned to love his arranged wife, if he'd found happiness within the constraints of pack politics and family expectations. She thought about Phoenix, growing up without knowing his father, without the privileges and opportunities that should have been his birthright. She thought about the choice Magnus Blackthorne had forced her to make 5 years ago, and whether that choice still protected the people she loved or simply perpetuated a lie that served no one. Most of all, she thought about the possibility that someone, she still didn't know who, was offering her a chance to reclaim the life she'd abandoned. The question was whether she was brave enough to take it. Outside her window, the moon hung full and bright above the swamplands, its silver light transforming the familiar landscape into something mysterious and full of possibility. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a sound of longing and recognition that echoed the feelings stirring in her chest for the first time in 5 years. Change was coming, whether she chose it or not. The only question was whether she would meet it as the frightened girl who had fled in terror, or as the woman she had become in the years since, stronger, wiser, and perhaps finally ready to fight for what had always been hers. Chapter 5. Return to the Shadows. 3 weeks later, Celeste stood in the lobby of a Manhattan high-rise, clutching Phoenix's small hand while he stared wide-eyed at the soaring ceiling and gleaming marble that seemed to stretch upward into infinity. Her son had never seen anything like the urban supernatural district, a place where ancient magic hummed beneath the surface of cutting-edge architecture, where wolves in $1,000 suits conducted business that shaped both worlds. "Mama, why is everything so tall?" Phoenix whispered, his voice echoing in the vast space despite his attempt at discretion. "Because sometimes people think they need to build upward to feel important," she replied, smoothing down his unruly hair with fingers that trembled only slightly. "But remember what we talked about. Real importance comes from how you treat others, not how impressive your building is." The move from Miami had happened with startling efficiency. Within days of accepting the urban tech position, she'd found herself with a lease on a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, enrollment paperwork for Phoenix's new preschool, and a moving truck ready to transport their few possessions north to whatever destiny awaited them. Mrs. Moonwhisper had seen them off with tears in her ancient eyes and a leather pouch filled with protective herbs that she'd pressed into Celeste's palm. "Some journeys take us away from home," the old healer had said. "Others take us toward the home we never knew we were seeking. Trust your instincts, child. They've kept you safe this long." Now, standing in the heart of the territory she'd fled 5 years ago, Celeste wondered if her instincts had finally led her astray. Every shadow seemed to hold potential recognition. Every face in the crowd might belong to someone who remembered the Omega girl who had disappeared without explanation from Crimson Academy. "Miss Rivers." A professional voice drew her attention to a young woman approaching across the lobby's expanse. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, Mr. Chen's assistant. He's waiting for you upstairs." Jennifer was polished in the way that spoke of expensive education and careful grooming, blonde hair in a perfect chignon, subtle makeup that enhanced rather than concealed, and a designer suit that probably cost more than Celeste's monthly rent. But her smile was genuine, and she crouched down to Phoenix's eye level with the kind of natural grace that suggested she genuinely enjoyed children. "And you must be Phoenix," she said warmly. "I heard you're 4 years old now. That's such an exciting age." Phoenix, who had inherited his mother's wariness around strangers, but also her innate curiosity about people, studied Jennifer with solemn dark eyes before nodding. "I can read chapter books now," he announced with the pride of someone who had recently mastered a significant skill. "Chapter books. That's impressive. What's your favorite story?" "The one about the dragon who learned his fire was for protecting people, not scaring them," Phoenix replied seriously. "Mama says sometimes we have to learn how to use our gifts the right way." Jennifer's smile faltered for just a moment, so briefly that someone less observant might have missed it entirely. But Celeste caught the flicker of something that looked like recognition, or perhaps understanding, before the professional mask slipped back into place. "That sounds like a very wise story," Jennifer said, standing gracefully. "Your mama sounds like a smart lady." The elevator ride to the 32nd floor passed in relative silence, broken only by Phoenix's occasional questions about the numbers lighting up on the display panel and the sensation of being carried upward through the building's steel and glass heart. Celeste found herself studying their reflection in the polished elevator doors, a young mother in her best professional attire, holding the hand of a dark-haired boy who looked more like his absent father with each passing day. Urban Tech Solutions occupied half the floor, with glass-walled conference rooms and open workspaces that buzzed with a kind of focused energy she remembered from her academy dreams of joining the technology sector. Programmers hunched over multiple monitors, project managers gestured animatedly over whiteboards covered in complex diagrams, and the air hummed with the particular intensity that came from solving challenging problems with brilliant minds. Marcus Chen's office was exactly as she remembered, lived in and functional, with evidence of real work rather than corporate theater. He stood when they entered, his smile encompassing both Celeste and Phoenix with the kind of inclusive warmth that immediately put her more at ease. "Phoenix," he said, addressing her son directly rather than talking over his head the way many adults did with children. "I heard you're going to be starting at a new school soon. Are you excited about meeting new friends?" Phoenix considered the question with his characteristic seriousness. "Maybe," he said finally. "Mama says new places can be scary at first, but they're also full of possibilities." "Your mama is very wise," Marcus agreed, exchanging a glance with Celeste that carried layers of meaning she couldn't quite decipher. "Phoenix, would you like to see something cool while your mama and I talk about grown-up work stuff?" He led them to a smaller conference room where an impressive setup of monitors and keyboards had been arranged alongside a selection of age-appropriate books and quiet toys. "This is our testing lab for educational software," Marcus explained. "We develop programs that help kids learn coding and problem-solving. Phoenix, if you'd like to try some of the games, Jennifer can show you how they work." It was cleverly done, providing Phoenix with entertainment that was both engaging and educational while ensuring he remained within sight but out of earshot. Jennifer settled beside him with the easy competence of someone who had clearly done this before, and soon Phoenix was absorbed in a colorful program that taught basic programming concepts through puzzle-solving adventures. "He's remarkable," Marcus said quietly as he and Celeste settled into chairs that offered a clear view of the testing area. "Intelligent, thoughtful, well-adjusted despite what must have been challenging circumstances." The observation felt loaded with meaning, but before Celeste could analyze it further, Marcus continued. "I wanted to discuss your role here, but I also need to address the unusual circumstances surrounding your employment." Here it was, the conversation she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "I assumed there was more to this opportunity than standard recruitment." "There is." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his professional demeanor shifting into something more personal and direct. "Celeste, I'm going to be completely honest with you, because I think you deserve to know what you're walking into." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. 5 years ago, you disappeared from the supernatural community under circumstances that left questions. Unanswered questions that have had consequences for people you care about. Her heart began to race, but she kept her expression neutral. "What kind of consequences?" "The kind that affects entire pack hierarchies and business empires." Marcus's voice carried a weight that suggested he was speaking from personal knowledge rather than second-hand information. "The kind that leaves powerful people looking for answers and closure." "Are you saying someone from the Blackthorn family knows I'm here?" The question emerged more sharply than she'd intended, fear for Phoenix's safety overriding diplomatic caution. "I'm saying that certain parties have been monitoring the situation, waiting for the right moment to address unfinished business." Marcus glanced toward the testing area where Phoenix was happily explaining his problem-solving strategy to Jennifer. Business that became significantly more complex when they learned about additional factors in the equation. The euphemisms were growing tiresome. "Mr. Chen, please speak plainly. Does Magnus Blackthorn know about my son?" "Magnus Blackthorn has been dead for 2 years." The words hit like a physical blow. Magnus, the architect of her exile, the man whose threats had driven her into hiding, was gone. The implications crashed over her in waves. The power structure that had made their love impossible might have shifted. The threats that had kept her in exile might no longer exist. The carefully constructed prison of circumstances might have crumbled without her knowledge. "How?" she whispered. "Heart attack, officially. Though there are those who suspect the stress of certain family complications may have contributed to his decline." Marcus's tone suggested layers of meaning that would require careful unpacking. His death created something of a succession crisis within both the pack hierarchy and the business empire. And Demon? Demon Blackthorn assumed leadership of both the pack and Obsidian Tower Corporation. But his position has been contested by various factions who question his suitability for absolute authority. Celeste felt the world tilting beneath her feet. The man she'd loved, the heir who had been so carefully groomed for leadership, was apparently struggling to maintain control of his inheritance. What kind of questions? Marcus hesitated, glancing again toward Phoenix with an expression that seemed to weigh complex ethical considerations. Questions about bloodline continuation. Questions about fertility and the ability to produce pack heirs. The implication hit her like lightning. In the supernatural world, an alpha's ability to father children wasn't just personal, it was political, spiritual, a demonstration of the strength and vitality necessary to lead. If Demon's marriage to Valentina Morrison had failed to produce offspring, his enemies would use that failure as evidence of fundamental weakness. He and Valentina have no children, she said, understanding flooding through her.
None.
Despite 5 years of marriage and considerable pressure from both families. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to ensure privacy. There are pack members who believe his inability to father heirs disqualifies him from leadership. Some have suggested more drastic solutions to the succession problem. The politics were brutal, but predictable. An alpha who couldn't produce the next generation was seen as failing in one of his most fundamental responsibilities. In the old days, such failures had led to challenges, depositions, and sometimes violent transfers of power. Where do I fit into this? She asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew. You, Miss Rivers, represent proof that Demon Blackthorn is perfectly capable of fathering children. Strong, intelligent, healthy children who carry his bloodline and could potentially inherit his abilities. Marcus's gaze moved pointedly toward Phoenix, who was now animatedly describing some aspect of his game to Jennifer. Children who could secure his position and silence his critics permanently. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Someone, she still didn't know who, had orchestrated her return not out of kindness or romantic sentiment, but as a political maneuver. Phoenix wasn't just her beloved son. He was living proof of Demon's genetic viability, a weapon in whatever power struggle was currently tearing apart the Blackthorn Empire. Who arranged this? She demanded. Who's been monitoring us? Who sent that note? Marcus smiled with what might have been sympathy or admiration for her quick understanding. Someone who believes that 5 years of separation has been punishment enough. Someone who thinks it's time for certain truths to come to light. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I'm authorized to give right now. He stood, moving to the window that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan's skyline. But I can tell you that your presence here serves multiple purposes. The job offer is genuine. We really do need someone with your skills, and you'll be working on legitimate projects that have nothing to do with pack politics. But your proximity is certain. Interested parties create opportunities that didn't exist when you were hiding in Florida. The calculated nature of her return made her stomach turn. She thought she was making a choice about her and Phoenix's future, but apparently she'd been maneuvered into position like a chess piece in someone else's game. What if I refuse to play along? What if I take Phoenix and disappear again? Marcus turned from the window, his expression suggesting he'd expected this question. You could do that. You have every right to prioritize your son's safety and your own peace of mind over the political complications of other people. But Phoenix is growing up. Soon he'll start asking more pointed questions about his father, about why they've never met, about the heritage he's been denied. Marcus's voice carried the weight of someone who understood the long-term implications. And Demon Blackthorn is fighting for his life, not just politically, but literally. There are factions within the supernatural community who would prefer to see him dead rather than accept his continued leadership. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Demon was in danger, and Phoenix was the key to ensuring his survival. But using her son as a political tool went against every protective instinct she possessed. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course. But while you're thinking, consider this. Phoenix deserves to know his father. And Demon deserves to know he has a son who could inherit everything he's fighting to preserve. From the testing area, Phoenix's delighted laughter rang out as he solved a particularly challenging puzzle. The sound was pure joy, untainted by the complex political calculations that surrounded his very existence. Will you at least commit to staying through the trial period? Marcus asked. 6 months to get settled, do the work you were hired for, and make decisions about the future from a position of stability rather than panic. It was reasonable, practical, and probably the best offer she was going to get from whatever forces had orchestrated this situation. 6 months would give her time to understand the current political landscape, assess the actual level of danger, and figure out how to protect Phoenix while potentially reuniting him with his father. 6 months, she agreed. But if I determine that staying puts Phoenix at risk, we leave immediately. No arguments, no negotiations. Agreed. Marcus extended his hand, and she shook it with the feeling that she was sealing a pact with implications far beyond a simple employment contract. Welcome to Urban Tech Solutions, Celeste. I have a feeling your time here is going to be eventful. That evening, as she unpacked boxes in their new Queen's apartment while Phoenix explored his new bedroom with the boundless energy of a 4-year-old discovering territory, Celeste found herself standing at the window that offered a distant view of Manhattan's glittering skyline. Somewhere in that maze of lights and shadows, Demon Blackthorn was fighting to maintain control of an empire built on secrets and supernatural power. Somewhere out there, he was struggling with the same loneliness and regret that had haunted her for 5 years, not knowing that the solution to his problems was sleeping in a race car bed in Queens, clutching a stuffed dragon and dreaming of adventures yet to come. The question that would determine all their futures remained unanswered. When the truth finally came to light, and it would, she was certain of that now. Would it heal the wounds that had festered for half a decade, or would it destroy everything they'd built in the wreckage of their impossible love? Outside her window, the city hummed with supernatural energy and human ambition, a testament to the complex dance between two worlds that had shaped her entire life. Tomorrow she would begin work on legitimate technology projects while navigating the treacherous currents of pack politics and family secrets. Tonight, she would hold her son close and prepare for whatever storms lay ahead. The game had begun whether she wanted to play or not. The only question now was whether she could protect the people she loved while the powerful forces around them maneuvered for advantage. In the distance, a wolf howled, an urban pack's call cutting through the city's electronic symphony, a reminder that beneath all the glass and steel, the old powers still held sway. Change was coming, riding the wind from the territories of her past. Whether it brought redemption or destruction would depend on choices she hadn't even realized she would need to make. Chapter 6. The Inevitable Discovery. 6 weeks into their new life in New York, Celeste had almost convinced herself that she could maintain the delicate balance between her professional responsibilities and the careful anonymity that kept Phoenix safe. Urban Tech Solutions had proven to be exactly what Marcus Chun had promised. Challenging work with brilliant colleagues, meaningful projects that utilized her skills, and a corporate culture that respected both excellence and work-life balance. Phoenix had adapted to city life with the resilience that seemed to be his defining characteristic. His new preschool, Riverside Academy for Young Minds, was a progressive institution that encouraged curiosity and creative problem-solving. His teachers praised his intelligence and maturity, though they'd also noted his tendency to ask probing questions about family structures and his intense interest in stories about fathers and sons finding each other. He's processing something, his lead teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had mentioned during their first parent conference. Children often use narrative exploration to understand their own experiences. You might consider whether there are any family stories or connections he's curious about. The suggestion had haunted Celeste through sleepless nights spent weighing Phoenix's emotional needs against the potential dangers of revelation. Her son was growing more inquisitive about his father with each passing day, his questions becoming more specific and harder to deflect with vague reassurances about complicated adult situations. She'd been so focused on navigating these internal challenges that she'd failed to notice the external surveillance. The realization came on a Tuesday morning in late October, when autumn had painted Central Park in brilliant reds and golds that reminded her painfully of the trees surrounding Crimson Academy. She was walking Phoenix to preschool, their usual route taking them through the safer, well-patrolled streets of their Queens neighborhood, when her supernatural senses finally registered what her conscious mind had been too distracted to acknowledge. They were being followed. The scent was subtle, carefully masked with human cologne and urban pollution, but unmistakably supernatural. Wolf, specifically. And not just any wolf, but one with the particular blend of power and restraint that marked pack leadership. Her heart began to race as she tightened her grip on Phoenix's small hand, her mind racing through possibilities and escape routes. Had Magnus Blackthorn's enemies discovered their location? Was this some remnant of the old Patriarch's network, intent on eliminating loose ends that might complicate the current power structure? "Mama, you're squeezing too tight," Phoenix said, looking up at her with the concerned expression he wore when the adult world's anxieties intruded on his carefully protected childhood. "Sorry, little wolf," she murmured, forcing her grip to relax while her supernatural senses remained on high alert. "I was just thinking about work." The follower maintained a careful distance, professional surveillance rather than immediate threat. Someone who wanted to observe without being detected, to gather information rather than take action. That realization was both comforting and terrifying because it suggested long-term planning rather than impulsive violence. At the preschool, she went through the motions of the morning routine, kissing Phoenix goodbye, exchanging pleasantries with other parents, confirming pickup times with his teachers. But her attention remained split between normal human behavior and the supernatural predator who watched from the shadows. As she walked toward the subway station, she made a calculated decision. Instead of taking her usual route to Manhattan, she doubled back through a series of side streets and alleyways, using the urban environment to her advantage in ways that years of living carefully had taught her. The follower was good, maintaining distance while adapting to her changed route with the fluid efficiency of someone accustomed to urban tracking. But Celeste had spent 5 years perfecting the art of invisibility, and she had advantages that professional surveillance might not anticipate. She led the pursuit through Queens' labyrinthine neighborhoods until she reached Flushing Meadows Park, where the autumn morning had drawn enough joggers and dog walkers to provide both cover and witnesses. Then, in a move that would have made Mrs. Moonwhisper proud, she simply disappeared. The technique was old pack magic, not true invisibility, but a way of blending with the environment that made supernatural senses slide past without registering. She pressed herself against a massive oak tree and let her wolf spirit sink into the kind of stillness that predators used when hunting, becoming part of the landscape rather than a figure moving through it. The follower passed within 10 feet of her hiding spot, and she finally got a clear look at her pursuer. He was tall and lean with a kind of elegant bone structure that spoke to excellent breeding, dressed in the casual but expensive clothes that marked him as someone accustomed to moving through both supernatural and human worlds. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and his face bore the kind of sharp intelligence that suggested he was more than just muscle hired for surveillance work. But it was his scent that made her breath catch in her throat, cedar and smoke with an underlying wildness that was achingly, impossibly familiar. Not demon. The scent was similar but distinct, like a variation on a theme that her wolf spirit recognized but couldn't quite place. Family, her instincts whispered. Someone who shared bloodline markers with the man she'd loved and fled from. The follower paused in the middle of the path, his head turning as his own supernatural senses searched for the quarry that had seemingly vanished. After a moment, he pulled out his phone and made a brief call. "She's more skilled than expected," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of expensive education and careful breeding. Old pack training, probably learned from someone who survived the territory wars. There was a pause as he listened to the voice on the other end. "No, I don't think she's a threat. But she's definitely not the helpless Omega the files suggested. This changes the approach we'll need to take." Another pause, longer this time. "Understood. I'll maintain surveillance, but increase distance. And sir, you should know that the boy is remarkable. Even from a distance, the resemblance is unmistakable." Celeste's heart nearly stopped. They knew about Phoenix. Whoever was orchestrating the surveillance had identified her son and recognized his parentage. The carefully constructed anonymity she'd built around their new life was crumbling, and she had no idea how to protect him from forces she couldn't identify or predict. The follower ended his call and continued down the path, apparently satisfied that his quarry had genuinely escaped. Celeste waited until his scent had completely faded before emerging from her hiding spot, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. Someone with access to old files and detailed intelligence was investigating her and Phoenix. Someone with the resources to conduct professional surveillance was building a case or preparing an action plan. And someone in Demon's bloodline was personally involved in whatever scheme was unfolding. She needed answers, and she needed them immediately. The subway ride to Manhattan passed in a blur of anxiety and planning. By the time she reached the urban tech offices, she'd made several decisions that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. She was done being a passive piece in someone else's game. It was time to take control of the situation before it spiraled beyond her ability to protect Phoenix. Marcus Chun was in his office, reviewing project proposals with the focused intensity she'd come to associate with his management style. When she knocked on his door, he looked up with the mild surprise of someone whose schedule had just been disrupted. "Celeste? Is everything all right? You look." "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her with more force than strictly necessary. "And I need you to tell me the truth this time." Something in her tone must have conveyed the seriousness of her mood, because Marcus immediately set aside his work and gestured for her to take a seat. "What's happened?" "I was followed this morning. Professional surveillance by someone with supernatural tracking skills and detailed knowledge of my background." She leaned forward, her voice carrying the kind of intensity that brooked no evasion. "Someone who knows about Phoenix and has been reporting his resemblance to certain parties." Marcus's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, concern, and what might have been resignation. "I see. That's all you have to say. I see." Her voice rose slightly before she caught herself and forced it back to a more professional level. "Marcus, someone is investigating my son. Someone with resources and connections is building a case or preparing some kind of action. And you're going to sit there and pretend you don't know anything about it." He was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing competing loyalties and obligations. Finally, he sighed and moved to ensure his office door was properly closed. "Celeste, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room. There are people whose safety depends on certain information remaining confidential until the right moment." "Whose safety?" she demanded. "Phoenix's? Mine? Or someone else's? All of the above." Marcus returned to his chair but remained perched on its edge, his body language suggesting readiness for flight or fight. "The surveillance you detected this morning was not hostile. It was protective." "Protective of whom?" "Of you and Phoenix. And of someone who has been waiting 5 years for the chance to know his son exists." The confirmation hit like a physical blow, even though she'd been expecting it. Demon knows. Demon suspects. He doesn't know for certain, because the people protecting him haven't been willing to confirm what they believe until they were sure you and Phoenix would be safe from the political fallout. The careful phrasing suggested layers of complexity that made her head spin. What political fallout? Marcus stood and moved to his window, staring out at the Manhattan skyline with the expression of someone carrying burdens he'd rather not bear. "Celeste, when Magnus Blackthorne died 2 years ago, he took certain secrets to his grave. Secrets about why you really disappeared, about threats that were made and bargains that were struck." Her mouth went dry. "What kind of secrets?" "The kind that would destroy several reputations and possibly trigger a pack war if they came to light improperly." He turned back to face her, his expression grave. "Magnus documented his conversation with you 5 years ago. Insurance, he called it. Proof that he'd been protecting pack interests against sentimental complications." "He recorded our meeting?" The violation felt like a physical wound. "Audio and written notes. Detailed accounts of the threats he made, the pressure he applied, the resources he used to force your compliance." Marcus's voice carried disgust that seemed genuine. When those files were discovered after his death, certain people realized that justice had been severely delayed. The pieces were falling into place, with sickening clarity. Someone found Magnus' files and decided to what? Rectify his mistakes. Someone found Magnus' files and realized that Demon had been manipulated just as thoroughly as you had been. that he'd been living with grief and guilt for 5 years over choices he'd never actually been allowed to make. The implications were staggering. If Demon learned that his grandfather had threatened her into disappearing, if he discovered that Magnus had destroyed their relationship through blackmail and intimidation rather than Celeste's free choice. "Where is he now?" she asked quietly. "Fighting for his political life," Marcus replied bluntly. The pack factions that opposed his leadership have been growing bolder since Magnus' death. They've been pushing for a formal challenge to his authority, claiming that his inability to produce heirs proves his unfitness for leadership. And Phoenix represents proof that those claims are false. Phoenix represents more than that. Marcus returned to his chair, his expression suggesting they were approaching the heart of whatever conspiracy had brought her back to New York. Phoenix represents the future of the Blackthorn bloodline and the pack's continued stability. But more importantly, from Demon's perspective, Phoenix represents the son he never knew he'd lost. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her choices wouldn't just affect her own life or even Phoenix's future. They would determine the fate of an entire pack hierarchy and the political balance of the supernatural community. "What do you want from me?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "We want you to make the choice you should have been allowed to make 5 years ago," Marcus said simply. Without threats, without manipulation, without anyone else's agenda taking precedence over what's best for you and your son. "And if I choose to disappear again? If I decide that the safest option is to take Phoenix and run?" Marcus's smile was sad but understanding. "Then you'll have the resources and support you need to disappear so completely that even supernatural surveillance won't be able to find you. That's a promise." The offer was more generous than she'd expected, which made it all the more suspicious. "And if I choose to stay? If I decide that Phoenix deserves to know his father? Then you'll have all the protection and support that the Blackthorn name can provide. And Phoenix will have the heritage and opportunities that are his birthright." It sounded almost too good to be true, which meant it probably was. "What's the catch?" "The catch," Marcus said heavily, "is that once this particular cat is out of the bag, there's no putting it back. If Phoenix's existence becomes public knowledge, he becomes a target for every faction that wants to control or destroy Demon's power. If Demon acknowledges Phoenix as his heir, the boy's entire life becomes subject to pack politics and supernatural intrigue." The stakes were even higher than she'd realized. Phoenix wouldn't just be gaining a father, he'd be inheriting a legacy of power, responsibility, and danger that would shape every aspect of his future. "How long do I have to decide?" "Not long," Marcus admitted. The protective surveillance this morning was a response to increased chatter among Demon's enemies. There are indications that hostile factions may be planning some kind of move against his leadership. If they succeed in deposing him, Phoenix's safety could become complicated. The timeline was compressing, forcing her toward a decision she'd hoped to delay until she better understood the full scope of the situation. But life, it seemed, had other plans. "I need to see him," she said suddenly, the words emerging before her rational mind could intervene. "Before I make any decisions about Phoenix's future, I need to see Demon myself. I need to know what kind of man he's become, whether he's someone I can trust with our son's well-being." Marcus nodded as if he'd been expecting this request. "That can be arranged. But it needs to happen soon, and it needs to happen carefully. There are people watching Demon's every move, looking for any sign of weakness or distraction they can exploit." "When?" "Tonight. There's a pack function at the Blackthorn estate, a formal dinner for visiting dignitaries. Security will be tight, but there are ways to arrange a private meeting without drawing unwanted attention." The prospect of returning to the place where their love story had begun was both thrilling and terrifying. But if she was going to gamble Phoenix's future on reuniting with his father, she needed to look Demon Blackthorn in the eyes and judge for herself whether he'd grown into someone worthy of their son's trust. "Arrange it," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But if this is some kind of trap, if Phoenix gets hurt because of whatever game you people are playing—" "It's not a game," Marcus said firmly. "And Phoenix's safety is everyone's top priority. But Celeste? You should know that Demon has never stopped looking for you. Never stopped believing that someday he'd find you again and have the chance to apologize for whatever drove you away. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. While she'd been hiding in the southern sanctuary, convinced that he'd moved on with his arranged marriage and forgotten their brief, impossible love, he'd been searching for her, carrying his own guilt and grief, never knowing that she'd been forced away by threats and manipulation rather than her own choice. Tonight, she would see him again. Tonight, they would finally have the conversation that should have happened 5 years ago, before Magnus Blackthorn's machinations tore their world apart. Tonight, everything would change, for better or worse. The only question was whether either of them would survive the truth. Chapter 7. The Reunion. The Blackthorn estate looked exactly as Celeste remembered. Gothic spires reaching toward the star-scattered sky, ancient oaks standing sentinel over manicured grounds, and windows glowing with warm light that spoke of power, tradition, and secrets kept for generations. But tonight, as she approached through the carefully planned route Marcus had arranged, the familiar landscape felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. She'd left Phoenix with Jennifer Walsh, who had revealed herself to be far more than Marcus's assistant. She was a trained bodyguard with connections to supernatural security networks, positioned specifically to protect Phoenix should the evening's revelations trigger hostile responses from Demon's enemies. Her son had been thrilled with what he believed was an impromptu sleepover with his new friend, complete with pizza, movies, and a promise of pancakes in the morning. "Be good for Miss Jennifer," Celeste had told him, pressing a kiss to his forehead while her heart ached with the possibility that everything might change before she saw him again. "I will, Mama," Phoenix had replied with his characteristic solemnity. "Are you going somewhere important?" "Very important," she'd admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "I'm going to see someone I knew a long time ago. Someone who might have answers to some of your questions." Phoenix's dark eyes, so heartbreakingly similar to his father's, had studied her with a kind of intuitive understanding that children sometimes displayed when the adult world's complexities brushed against their carefully protected innocence. "Is it about my daddy?" he'd asked quietly. "Yes, little wolf. It's about your daddy." Now, moving through the shadows of the estate's gardens, Celeste wondered if she was making the right choice or walking into a disaster that would destroy the fragile stability she'd built for her son. The years had changed her in ways that went far deeper than physical appearance. She was stronger now, more confident in her own worth, less willing to accept other people's definitions of her value or destiny. But Demon, what kind of man had he become? Had the responsibilities of leadership hardened him into a replica of his grandfather, or had grief and loss taught him compassion for others caught in impossible circumstances? The service entrance Marcus had directed her to was hidden beneath a stone archway overgrown with climbing roses that had long since lost their blooms to autumn's chill. The door opened at her approach, revealing a woman in her 50s whose elegant posture and discerning eyes marked her as someone accustomed to managing complex situations with discretion. "Miss Rivers," the woman said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of expensive education and years of practice in supernatural diplomacy. "I'm Helena Morrison, head of household staff. Mr. Chen asked me to ensure your visit remains private." Morrison, the same surname as Demon's wife, though this woman was clearly old enough to be Valentina's mother. The family connections in the supernatural community were as intricate as they were politically significant. "Thank you," Celeste replied, studying Helena's expression for signs of hostility or judgment. Instead, she found something that looked like sympathy, tinged with what might have been relief. "If I may say so," Helena continued, leading her through a maze of service corridors that bypassed the main entertaining areas. "There are many of us who have hoped for this day. Mr. Demon has not been himself since his grandfather's passing. Perhaps tonight will provide some of the answers he's been seeking." The observation was carefully neutral, but Celeste caught the undertone of genuine concern for Demon's well-being. Whatever his marriage to Valentina had become, it apparently hadn't provided the emotional support or happiness that those who cared about him had hoped to see. "Mrs. Morrison," Celeste said as they climbed a narrow staircase that led toward the estate's private family quarters, "may I ask about Mrs. Blackthorn? Valentina?" Helena paused, her hand resting on the banister as she considered how much information was appropriate to share. Valentina is a remarkable young woman. Intelligent, capable, perfectly suited to the demands of pack politics and business leadership. The careful phrasing spoke volumes about what wasn't being said. But marriage requires more than political compatibility, Helena said quietly. And some wounds take longer to heal than others expected. They stopped before a heavy oak door that bore the Blackthorn family crest in polished brass. Helena knocked softly in what was apparently a prearranged signal, then stepped back with the practiced discretion of someone who had spent decades managing sensitive family situations. "He's waiting for you," she said simply, then melted back into the shadowed corridor with the quiet efficiency that marked truly skilled household staff. Celeste stood before the door for a moment that stretched into eternity, her hand hovering over the brass handle while her heart hammered against her ribs. Behind this door waited for the man she loved with the desperate intensity of first love, the father of her child, the alpha whose political survival might depend on the conversation they were about to have. Behind this door waited answers to questions that had haunted her for 5 years, and possibly the destruction of the careful anonymity that had kept Phoenix safe from the dangerous complexities of his heritage. She turned the handle and stepped into her past. The room was Demon's private study, smaller and more personal than the formal office where Magnus had once held court, filled with books that showed evidence of actual reading rather than decorative display. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across furniture that spoke of comfort rather than ostentation. And there, standing with his back to the door while he stared into the flames, was the man who had haunted her dreams for half a decade. Demon Blackthorn had grown into his power in ways that took her breath away. The uncertain heir she'd fallen in love with at 18 had been replaced by someone who radiated the kind of confident authority that came from years of making difficult decisions and living with their consequences. He was taller than she remembered, broader through the shoulders, with the kind of presence that seemed to fill whatever space he occupied. His midnight hair was longer now, touching his collar with waves that suggested he'd been running his fingers through it, a nervous habit from their academy days that apparently hadn't changed. When he turned at the sound of her entrance, she saw that his face had gained the kind of sharp-edged maturity that spoke of leadership responsibilities and personal loss. But his eyes were exactly as she remembered, dark as midnight and deeper than starlight, holding the same complex intelligence and carefully hidden vulnerability that had first captured her heart in a third-floor library a lifetime ago. Celeste. Her name on his lips was a prayer and a question, and an accusation, all wrapped together. "You came." "You asked me to," she replied, her voice steadier than she'd expected despite the way her entire body seemed to vibrate with awareness of his proximity. They stood there in the firelight, separated by 8 feet of Persian carpet that might as well have been an ocean of years and regret and choices neither had been free to make. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they needed to say and weren't sure how to begin. "You look." Demon paused, his gaze taking in the changes 5 years had wrought. The way motherhood had added curves to her formerly slight frame, the confidence that now marked her posture, the strength that showed in her eyes despite the vulnerability of returning to the place where their love had been destroyed. "You look incredible. Strong. Different. 5 years of single motherhood will do that," she said, the words emerging with more edge than she'd intended. The mention of her child hit him like a physical blow. She saw the impact in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his hands clenched at his sides, as if he were fighting the urge to reach for her or possibly shake the truth out of her. "Marcus told me," he said quietly, "about your son. About the timing." The careful phrasing made her chest tighten with something that felt like hope and terror combined. "What exactly did Marcus tell you?" "That you have a 4-year-old boy named Phoenix. That he was born approximately 9 months after you disappeared." Demon's voice carried the weight of someone who had spent considerable time doing mathematical calculations and reaching conclusions that changed everything. "That he bears a strong resemblance to certain members of the Blackthorn family." The confession hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. He knew. Maybe he didn't have absolute confirmation, But he knew in the way that wolves always knew when something belonged to them, when pack bonds ran deeper than logic or denial. "Demon," she began, but he held up a hand that trembled slightly despite his apparent composure. "Before you say anything else," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need you to know something. I need you to understand what happened after you left." He moved to the window that overlooked the estate's gardens, his reflection ghost-like in the glass as he stared out at the landscape where they'd once walked and dreamed of impossible futures. "I looked for you," he said quietly. 4 months after you disappeared, I hired private investigators, contacted packs across the continent, and followed every possible lead. I was convinced that something terrible had happened, that someone had hurt you, or threatened you, or... His voice trailed off, but she could hear the years of guilt and self-recrimination in the silence that followed. "I thought it was my fault," he continued. "I thought I'd pushed too hard, moved too fast, made you feel trapped between me and my family's expectations. The last conversation we had, you seemed frightened, overwhelmed. I convinced myself that you'd run because being with me had become unbearable." The pain in his voice was like a knife between her ribs. While she'd been in exile, believing he'd moved on and forgotten her, he'd been torturing himself with guilt over choices he'd never actually made. "It wasn't your fault," she said softly, the words carrying 5 years of suppressed longing and regret. "Demon, what happened between us that night? It was beautiful. You didn't push me away. I was forced away." He turned from the window, his dark eyes searching her face with desperate intensity. "Forced? By whom?" The moment of truth had arrived, and with it the choice that would determine not just their future, but the future of the child who carried both their DNA and their hope for something better than the political machinations that had separated them. "Your grandfather," she said simply, and watched as understanding and fury warred across his features. "Magnus." The name emerged as a growl that carried undertones of his wolf's rage. "What did he do to you?" "He made me an offer I couldn't refuse." The old phrase carried bitter irony when applied to supernatural politics and family manipulation. "He explained very clearly that my continued presence in your life would destroy everything you'd been raised to inherit. That loving me would make you weak, vulnerable to challenges from pack factions that questioned your fitness to lead." Demon's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his wolf rising to the surface in ways that made his human form seem barely adequate to contain the fury building within him. "He threatened you," he said, the words carrying deadly certainty. "He threatened everyone I loved. My grandmother's job, my academy scholarship, our family's continued residence in pack territory." Celeste forced herself to meet his gaze despite the way her heart was breaking all over again. "But mostly, he threatened you. He made it very clear that defying him would have consequences for your position as heir, your relationship with the pack, your ability to inherit the leadership you've been trained for since childhood. So you left to protect me." The realization seemed to hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and the strength from his knees. He sank into one of the leather chairs beside the fireplace, his head in his hands as the full scope of his grandfather's manipulation became clear. "I left to protect all of us," she corrected gently, "including the child I didn't know I was carrying until 3 weeks later." The confession hung in the air between them like a star being born, brilliant, transformative, and capable of changing the gravitational pull of everything in its orbit. Demon's head shot up, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of wonder, grief, and desperate hope. "You were pregnant when you left? You've been raising my son alone for 4 years." "Our son," she corrected, moving closer to the fireplace where the dancing flames cast golden light across both their faces. "His name is Phoenix Blackthorn Rivers, though he's never known his father's identity. He's brilliant and curious and kind, with your eyes and your stubborn cowlick and your way of seeing straight through to the heart of complicated problems." Tears tracked down Demon's cheeks, the first time she'd ever seen him cry, the first crack in the composed mask he'd worn for so long that she'd almost forgotten the vulnerable man beneath the Alpha's authority. "For years," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of birthday parties missed, bedtime stories never read, first steps and first words and 1,000 small milestones that could never be reclaimed. 4 years of his life gone. 4 years of not knowing I had a son who needed me. He asks about you constantly, Celeste said, settling into the chair across from him with the feeling that they were finally having the conversation that should have happened 5 years ago. He wants to know why he doesn't have a daddy like the other children, why we live alone, whether you would love him if you met him. The questions hit Demon like physical blows, each one a reminder of the relationship that had been stolen from both father and son by an old man's political calculations and manipulative control. What do you tell him? He asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. The truth, as much as I can without breaking his heart or yours. That his daddy is a good man who lives far away, that sometimes adults have to make difficult choices to protect the people they love, that love is complicated but never wrong. And now, Demon leaned forward, his intense gaze fixed on her face, as if he were trying to memorize every detail. Now that the truth is finally out, now that we know what really happened and who is responsible for keeping us apart, what happens now? It was the question she'd been asking herself since Marcus first revealed the political undercurrents that had brought her back to New York. The question that would determine not just her own future, but Phoenix's heritage and Demon's political survival. That depends, she said carefully, on what kind of man you've become. On whether you're someone I can trust with Phoenix's safety and happiness. On whether you want to be his father for the right reasons, or just because he represents a solution to your political problems. The challenge was direct and necessary, cutting through the emotional reunion to address the practical realities they would need to navigate. Demon's response would tell her everything she needed to know about whether the man she'd loved had grown into someone worthy of their son's trust. Celeste, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute sincerity, I don't give a damn about pack politics or succession crises or what Phoenix represents to anyone else. I care about the fact that I have a son I've never held, never read stories to, never tucked into bed at night. I care about the 4 years of his life that were stolen from both of us by an old man's need to control every aspect of his family's destiny. He stood and moved to kneel before her chair, his hands covering hers with warmth that sent electricity racing up her arms. But more than anything, he continued, his dark eyes holding hers with desperate intensity, I care about the woman who sacrificed everything to protect him, who raised him alone, kept him safe, gave him love and strength, and all the things I should have been there to provide. I care about you, Celeste. I never stopped loving you, never stopped hoping that someday I'd find you again and have the chance to build the life we should have had. The declaration was everything she'd dreamed of hearing for 5 years, but the practical complications remained as daunting as ever. And, Valentina? She asked quietly. Your wife, your political alliance, the marriage that was supposed to secure your position as alpha? Pain flashed across Demon's features, followed by something that looked like relief at finally being able to speak the truth about his arranged marriage. Valentina and I. He paused, choosing his words carefully. We have a marriage of political convenience that has never become anything more personal. We're friends, allies in pack politics, partners in business decisions. But we're not lovers, not mates, not the kind of husband and wife who share hearts as well as names. The admission should have brought relief, but instead it raised new questions about the practical obstacles they would face in building any kind of future together. Does she know? About Phoenix, about why I really left. She knows about you, Demon said quietly. She's always known that I married her for political reasons rather than personal ones. She's also smart enough to have figured out that the timing of your return and the recent discoveries about my grandfather's files aren't coincidental. And she's willing to, what? Step aside so you can reunite with your first love and claim your secret son? Demon's smile was rueful, tinged with the complexity of supernatural politics and personal relationships that defied easy categorization. Valentina Morrison is many things, intelligent, ambitious, politically astute, fiercely protective of pack interests. But she's not cruel, and she's not someone who believes in perpetuating injustices just because they serve her immediate interests. He squeezed her hands gently, his touch anchoring her to the moment and the possibility of hope. She wants me to be happy, Celeste. and she wants Phoenix to have the family he deserves. The generosity seemed too good to be true, which made Celeste immediately suspicious of hidden motives and unstated complications. "What's the catch?" she asked. "What are you telling me about the political situation, about the risks we'd be taking if we tried to build a public life together?" Demon's expression grew grave as he returned to his chair, the brief moment of personal connection giving way to the harsh realities of pack leadership and supernatural politics. "The catch," he said heavily, "is that there are factions within the pack who have been looking for any excuse to challenge my authority. They've been claiming that my inability to produce heirs proves my unfitness to lead, that the pack needs an alpha who can ensure genetic continuity and political stability. And Phoenix represents proof that their claims are false. Phoenix represents more than that. He represents the future of the Blackthorn bloodline and the pack's continued prosperity. But acknowledging him publicly would also make him a target for anyone who wants to eliminate potential threats to their own political ambitions." The stakes were even higher than she'd realized. Phoenix wouldn't just be gaining a father and a heritage, he'd be stepping into the crosshairs of supernatural politics that could literally get him killed. "So, what do you propose?" she asked. "How do we protect him while giving him the family he deserves?" Carefully, Demon said with a grimness that spoke to years of navigating treacherous political waters. "Gradually. With security measures and contingency plans, and the kind of strategic thinking that my grandfather should have used instead of threats and manipulation." Before she could respond, a soft knock interrupted their conversation. Helena Morrison's voice came through the heavy oak door with the kind of urgency that suggested immediate attention was required. "Mr. Demon? I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development that requires your immediate attention." Demon and Celeste exchanged glances that carried 5 years of interrupted conversations and postponed resolutions. "What kind of development?" Demon called. "The kind that involves unexpected guests and questions about recent staffing changes at Urban Tech Solutions," Helena replied, her tone carrying warning and apology in equal measure. Someone had discovered Celeste's presence at the estate. Someone with enough influence to demand immediate explanations and possibly enough hostility to turn their reunion into a political crisis. "Go," Celeste said, standing quickly as her protective instincts kicked into overdrive. "Handle whatever political crisis is brewing. I need to get back to Phoenix." "Celeste, wait." Demon caught her hand as she moved toward the door. "This isn't over. We've barely begun to work through everything that needs to be said, everything that needs to be decided." "I know," she replied, her heart racing with the implications of being discovered at the estate. "But Phoenix's safety comes first. If there are hostile factions investigating my presence here, then we deal with them," Demon said firmly, his alpha authority rising to the surface in ways that reminded her powerfully of the man he'd become in her absence. "Together this time. No more running, no more hiding, no more letting other people make our choices for us." The promise was everything she'd hoped to hear, but the immediate crisis required practical action rather than romantic declarations. "Call me when you know what we're dealing with," she said, squeezing his hand briefly before pulling away. "I'll be with Phoenix, and we'll figure out what comes next." Helena appeared in the doorway with the kind of efficient urgency that marked someone accustomed to managing family crises. "Miss Rivers, there's a service exit that will get you to your car without encountering the unexpected guests," she said quietly. "But you should know, questions are being asked about Urban Tech's recent hiring practices and the identity of certain new employees." The net was closing faster than any of them had anticipated. Within hours, Phoenix's existence and Celeste's return would be public knowledge among the supernatural community's most dangerous political factions. The game had begun whether they were ready or not. The only question now was whether they could protect the people they loved while the powerful forces around them maneuvered for advantage. As Celeste made her way through the estate's shadowed corridors toward an uncertain future, she carried with her the memory of Demon's tears and his promise that this time, they would face whatever came together. Whether that promise would be enough to protect Phoenix from the storm that was coming remained to be seen. Chapter 8. The storm breaks. The emergency call came at 3:47 a.m., jolting Celeste from the first peaceful sleep she'd managed since returning to New York. Jennifer's voice on the phone carried the kind of controlled urgency that made her blood run cold before she was fully awake. "They've made their move," Jennifer said without preamble. "Pack up everything you can carry in 10 minutes. We're relocating to Phoenix immediately." What happened? Celeste was already moving, muscle memory from years of careful living kicking in as she grabbed the go bag she'd kept packed since their first night in Queens. Demon's enemies leaked the story. Every supernatural news network in North America is running headlines about the secret Blackthorn heir and his mysterious mother. Phoenix's photo is already circulating on pack communication channels. The words hit like physical blows. Her worst nightmare was materializing. Phoenix's face exposed to the supernatural community, his existence broadcast to every faction that might see him as either a valuable asset or an unacceptable threat. "Where is he?" she demanded, throwing essential items into a suitcase with hands that shook despite her efforts to remain calm. "Safe. Still sleeping in the secure apartment, but we need to move him before dawn. There are already surveillance teams converging on your building." Through her bedroom window, Celeste could see black SUVs parked at strategic points throughout the neighborhood. Too many to be coincidence, too well positioned to be anything but coordinated supernatural surveillance. How did they find out? "Someone at the estate last night recognized you." Within hours, the information was sold to the highest bidder among Demon's political opponents. Jennifer's voice carried disgust at the betrayal, but also the kind of professional focus that came from years of managing crisis situations. The good news is that Demon saw this coming. He's been preparing contingencies. What kind of contingencies? The kind that involves relocating you and Phoenix to a secure location until the political situation stabilizes. Somewhere his enemies can't reach you, where Phoenix can be safe while Demon deals with the fallout. The plan sounded reasonable in theory, but Celeste had lived through enough upheavals to know that supernatural politics rarely unfolded according to anyone's carefully laid contingencies. Where? Details when we meet. Right now, focus on packing light and moving fast. The window for a clean extraction is closing. 20 minutes later, Celeste found herself in the back of an armored vehicle racing through Queens toward an unknown destination, her sleeping son cradled in her arms while Jennifer coordinated with security teams through an encrypted communication device that looked like it belonged in a spy thriller. Phoenix had woken briefly during the transfer, confused but trusting when she'd explained that they were going on an unexpected adventure. His easy acceptance of yet another disruption to their carefully constructed normal life broke her heart even as it reinforced her determination to protect him from the political machinations that threatened to consume them both. "Mama," he mumbled against her shoulder, his voice thick with sleep. "Are we moving again?" "Just for a little while, little wolf," she whispered, smoothing his unruly hair while the city blurred past outside bulletproof windows. "Until some grown-up problems get sorted out." "Is it because of my daddy?" The question carried the kind of intuitive understanding that children sometimes displayed when their world shifted around them in ways they couldn't quite comprehend. "Yes, baby. It's because of your daddy." Phoenix was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the serious consideration he brought to all complex adult situations that impacted his life. "Will I get to meet him soon?" he asked finally. "I hope so," Celeste replied, surprised by how much she meant it. "I really hope so." The secure location turned out to be a modernized farmhouse in the Hudson Valley, surrounded by enough acreage to provide both privacy and clear sight lines for security monitoring. The property had been retrofitted with a kind of defensive measures that spoke to serious preparation, reinforced windows, multiple communication systems, and what appeared to be a small army of supernatural security personnel positioned at strategic points around the perimeter. Marcus Chun was waiting for them on the wraparound porch, his usually polished appearance replaced by the kind of tactical clothing that suggested he was more than just a corporate HR director. "Welcome to Safe Harbor," he said, helping them out of the armored vehicle while Phoenix stared wide-eyed at the sprawling property and the obvious security preparations. "It's not exactly the suburban family life you were building, but it's secure." "For how long?" Celeste asked, studying the defensive positions and calculating the resources required to maintain this level of protection. "As long as necessary," Marcus replied, his tone suggesting that necessary might be measured in months rather than days. The farmhouse interior had been designed to feel welcoming despite its fortress-like security features. Phoenix immediately gravitated toward a living room equipped with books, educational toys, and a massive stone fireplace that reminded Celeste painfully of the study where she'd reunited with Demon just hours earlier. "Is this where we live now?" Phoenix asked, exploring the space with the kind of methodical thoroughness that marked him as his father's son. "For now," Celeste replied, settling onto one of the comfortable sofas while Jennifer conducted a security sweep of the upstairs rooms. "Will my daddy come visit us here?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, carrying all of Phoenix's hope and confusion about the father he'd never met but somehow understood was central to their current upheaval. "I don't know, little wolf. The situation is complicated." Marcus cleared his throat diplomatically. "Actually, there's something you should know about that. Demon is planning to make a public statement this morning. A press conference addressing the recent revelations and their implications for pack leadership." Celeste's heart lurched. "What kind of statement?" "The kind where he acknowledges Phoenix as his son and heir," Marcus said quietly. "The kind where he takes full responsibility for the circumstances that led to your separation and commits to ensuring Phoenix's safety and legitimacy within the pack hierarchy." The implications were staggering. By publicly claiming Phoenix, Demon would be simultaneously solving his political problems and making their son a permanent target for anyone who opposed Blackthorn leadership. "He can't do that," Celeste said, standing quickly as panic flooded her system. "Not without talking to me first, not without understanding what it means for Phoenix's safety." "He's trying to protect you both," Marcus replied. "By claiming Phoenix publicly, he removes the secrecy that his enemies have been using as a weapon. He also establishes Phoenix's legal right to Blackthorn protection and resources. And he makes Phoenix a target for every faction that wants to eliminate potential Blackthorn heirs," Celeste shot back. "Marcus, my son is 4 years old. He doesn't understand pack politics or supernatural hierarchies or why people might want to hurt him because of who his father is. Which is why he's here, surrounded by the kind of security that can keep him safe while Demon consolidates his position and eliminates the threats." The clinical approach to her son's safety made her wolf snarl with protective fury. "You're talking about my child like he's a political asset to be managed rather than a little boy who just wants to know why he doesn't have a daddy like the other kids." Before Marcus could respond, the farmhouse's communication system crackled to life with Jennifer's voice from the second floor. "We've got incoming," she announced. "Multiple vehicles approaching from the east. Supernatural signatures, but not hostile. Looks like Demon's personal security detail." Through the living room's reinforced windows, Celeste could see a convoy of black SUVs making their way up the private road toward the farmhouse. Her heart began to race with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. If Demon was coming here personally, it meant the political situation had escalated beyond anything they'd anticipated. "Phoenix," she said, kneeling beside her son who was absorbed in building an elaborate castle from the wooden blocks he'd found in a toy chest. "Someone very important is coming to see us. Someone who might have answers to some of your questions about family." Phoenix looked up from his construction project, his dark eyes, so achingly similar to his father's, studying her face with the kind of perceptive attention that made her wonder exactly how much he understood about their unusual circumstances. "Is it my daddy?" he asked with a direct simplicity that only children could manage. "Yes, little wolf. It's your daddy." The words hung in the air like a promise and a threat combined, carrying the weight of 5 years of separation and the possibility of either redemption or disaster. Outside, the convoy had stopped in the farmhouse's circular driveway, and figures were emerging from the vehicles with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke to extensive security training. Even through bulletproof glass, she could recognize Demon's tall frame and commanding presence as he moved toward the house, surrounded by bodyguards who scanned the perimeter with supernatural senses alert for any sign of threat. "He's here," she whispered, as much to herself as to Phoenix. "Can I meet him now?" Phoenix asked, his excitement obvious despite his attempt to maintain the serious demeanor he adopted for important occasions. "In a moment," Celeste replied, smoothing down his unruly cowlick while her heart hammered against her ribs. But Phoenix, I need you to remember that this is going to be new for everyone. Your daddy has never been a father before, and you've never had a daddy. It might take some time for everyone to figure out how this works. Phoenix nodded with the gravity of someone who had learned early that the adult world was full of complications that required careful navigation. The front door opened with the kind of controlled urgency that marked people accustomed to moving through potentially dangerous situations. Demon entered first, his presence immediately filling the farmhouse's main room in ways that made the spacious area seem suddenly intimate. He looked like he hadn't slept since their reunion the night before. His usually perfect hair was disheveled. His expensive suit showed signs of the kind of wear that came from crisis management, and his dark eyes held a mixture of determination and barely controlled anxiety that spoke to the magnitude of the decisions he'd been making. But when his gaze found Phoenix, everything else seemed to fall away. The 4-year-old boy who had been Celeste's entire world for years looked up at the tall stranger with curious dark eyes that were unmistakably identical to those staring down at him. The resemblance was so striking that even someone unfamiliar with genetics would have immediately recognized the family connection. "Hello," Phoenix said with the careful politeness his mother had taught him for meeting new people. "Are you my daddy?" The simple question hit Demon like a physical blow. Celeste watched as the composed alpha she'd seen the night before crumbled into something raw and vulnerable and completely overwhelmed by the reality of meeting his son for the first time. "Yes," Demon said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Yes, Phoenix. I'm your daddy." He knelt slowly, bringing himself closer to Phoenix's eye level while being careful not to overwhelm the child with his size or intensity. "I'm very sorry it took so long for us to meet. There were complications that kept me away. But I'm here now, and I want to be part of your life if you'd like that." Phoenix studied his father with the kind of thoughtful consideration he brought to all important decisions. "Mama says you're a good man who lives far away. She says sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices to protect people they love." "Your mama is very wise," Demon replied, his gaze flickering briefly to Celeste before returning to their son. "And she's been taking very good care of you. She's the best mama in the world," Phoenix declared with the absolute certainty that only 4-year-olds could muster. "She reads me stories every night and makes the best pancakes, and she's teaching me to be brave even when things are scary." "It sounds like she's done an amazing job," Demon said softly, and Celeste could hear the gratitude and regret warring in his voice. "Phoenix, would it be all right if I gave you a hug? I've been wanting to hug you for a very long time." Phoenix considered this request with his characteristic seriousness before nodding. "Okay, but I should tell you that I'm pretty good at hugs. Mama taught me." What followed was possibly the most emotionally devastating moment of Celeste's life. She watched as Demon carefully wrapped his arms around their son for the first time, as Phoenix hugged him back with the generous affection he showed to all the adults he deemed worthy of trust, as both father and son discovered what they'd been missing for 4 years. Demon's shoulders shook with silent tears as he held Phoenix close, breathing in the scent of his son and probably cataloging all the details he'd been denied. The way Phoenix's hair felt under his hands, the solid warmth of his small body, the chatter of a 4-year-old voice that carried genetic echoes of his own childhood. "You're really tall," Phoenix observed, pulling back to study his father's face with fascination. "And you have the same eyes as me. Mama said I got my eyes from someone special." "You got them from me," Demon confirmed, his voice still thick with emotion. "And I got them from my father, and he got them from his father. It's a family thing that goes back for generations." "Does that mean I'm part of your family now?" Phoenix asked, his question carrying the kind of hopeful vulnerability that made Celeste's chest tighten with protective love. "You've always been part of my family," Demon replied firmly. "I just didn't know where to find you. But now that I have, nothing is ever going to separate us again." The promise was beautiful and heartfelt and completely impossible to guarantee given the political realities they were facing. But watching Phoenix's face light up with joy at his father's words, Celeste found herself hoping against hope that somehow, someway, Demon would be able to keep that promise. "Mr. Blackthorn," Jennifer's voice interrupted from the doorway, her tone carrying the kind of urgency that meant their brief family reunion was about to be interrupted by the harsh realities of supernatural politics. "We've got a situation developing. You need to see this." Demon stood reluctantly, his hand remaining on Phoenix's shoulder as if he were afraid their son might disappear if he let go. "What kind of situation?" Jennifer activated the farmhouse's wall-mounted display screen, revealing a news broadcast from the Supernatural Broadcasting Network. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen made Celeste's blood run cold. Blackthorn heir discovered. Pack Council calls emergency session to address succession crisis. The news anchor, a perfectly groomed wolf whose human form projected the kind of authority that came from decades of covering pack politics, was speaking directly to the camera with the measured intensity of someone delivering information that would reshape the supernatural community's power structure. Sources within multiple pack territories confirm that Demon Blackthorn, current alpha of the prestigious Shadowmere Pack and CEO of Obsidian Tower Corporation, has fathered a male heir with an unmated Omega identified as Celeste Rivers. The anchor was saying. The child, reportedly 4 years old, has been living in exile with his mother in the Southern Sanctuary territories. The broadcast cut to file footage of the Blackthorn estate, then to what appeared to be surveillance photos of Celeste and Phoenix from their time in Miami, images that made her stomach turn with the realization that they'd been watched far longer than she'd realized. The revelation has prompted calls from several pack councils for an emergency session to address questions about the legitimacy of Blackthorn leadership and the succession rights of a child born outside traditional pack bonding ceremonies. The anchor continued. Pack law experts suggest that while the child's parentage appears undeniable based on genetic markers visible even in photographs, his legal status within the supernatural hierarchy remains unclear. Some factions are calling for formal recognition and immediate integration into pack leadership training, while others question whether an unmated Omega's offspring can legitimately inherit alpha status. The political implications were becoming clearer and more dangerous by the moment. Phoenix wasn't just Demon's son. He was the center of a legal and political battle that would determine the future of one of the most powerful supernatural dynasties in North America. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Celeste said, pulling Phoenix closer to her side as the broadcast continued to dissect their private lives for public consumption. "They're turning him into a political football." "Which is why we need to control the narrative," Demon replied, his voice shifting into the kind of authoritative tone that marked him as someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. "I'm calling a press conference for this afternoon. Full disclosure. Public acknowledgement of Phoenix as my heir, and a clear statement about our family's future." "Without consulting me?" Celeste's voice carried an edge of anger that made even his security details step back slightly. "Without asking what I think is best for our son? With the intention of protecting both of you." Demon shot back, his own alpha authority rising to meet her challenge. "Celeste, they're going to tear us apart piece by piece if we let them control the story. The only way to protect Phoenix is to claim him publicly and establish his rights under pack law before our enemies can manipulate the situation to their advantage." The argument was logical, practical, and completely terrifying from a mother's perspective. Public acknowledgement would provide Phoenix with legal protections and resource access he'd never had, but it would also make him a permanent target for every faction that opposed Blackthorn leadership. "And what about us?" she demanded. "What about the relationship we never had a chance to build? Are you planning to claim Phoenix as your heir, while keeping his unmarked mother as some kind of shameful secret?" The question hit Demon like a physical blow, but before he could respond, Phoenix himself intervened with the kind of innocent directness that only children could manage. "Why are you yelling at each other?" he asked, looking between his parents with the worried expression he wore when the adult world's complications intruded on his carefully protected innocence. "Did I do something wrong?" The question broke through their argument like sunlight through storm clouds, reminding them both that their primary responsibility was to the child who had been caught in circumstances beyond his understanding or control. "No, little wolf," Celeste said, kneeling beside him with her voice gentle despite the turmoil raging in her chest. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements about how to solve complicated problems. Are you and Daddy having a disagreement about me?" Phoenix asked with the perceptive understanding that made her wonder exactly how much he'd absorbed from the news broadcast and the tension in the room. "We're having a disagreement about how to keep you safe," Demon said, moving to kneel beside Celeste so that they were both at Phoenix's eye level. "There are some people who might not understand how special you are, and we want to make sure they can't hurt you or make you sad." Phoenix considered this explanation with his characteristic seriousness. Mrs. Moonwhisper used to say that when people are scared or confused, they sometimes make bad choices. She said the best thing to do is be brave and tell the truth and trust that good people will help you. The wisdom of a 4-year-old, filtered through the teachings of an ancient healer who had seen enough of the world to understand its essential truths, hit both parents with the force of revelation. "Mrs. Moonwhisper sounds very wise," Demon said softly, his gaze meeting Celeste's over their son's head. "What do you think, Phoenix? Should we be brave and tell the truth about our family?" "I think people should know that I have a daddy now," Phoenix said with a confident certainty that only children could muster. "I think they should know that my mama is the best mama in the world and that you're going to take good care of both of us." The simple faith in his voice broke through the last of Celeste's resistance. Her son deserved to know his heritage, to claim his birthright, to live without shame or secrecy about who he was and where he came from. "All right," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "We tell the truth. We claim our family publicly. But Demon, if this puts Phoenix in danger, if your enemies use him as a weapon against you, then I'll eliminate the threats," Demon replied with a kind of deadly certainty that reminded her exactly how powerful and dangerous he'd become in the years of their separation. "Anyone who threatens our son will discover exactly why the Blackthorn name has survived in pack leadership for over 2 centuries. The promise was both comforting and terrifying, carrying implications about the lengths he would go to protect their family that she wasn't sure she was ready to contemplate. "When?" she asked. "This afternoon. Full press conference, complete disclosure, and a formal announcement about our plans for the future." Demon stood, his expression shifting into the focused intensity that marked him as someone preparing for battle. "By sunset tonight, everyone in the supernatural community will know that Phoenix Rivers Blackthorn is my son and heir." "And what about us?" Celeste asked, the question carrying 5 years of uncertainty and hope. "What about the relationship we never got to build?" Demon's smile was soft and devastating and full of promises that made her heart race despite all the complications surrounding them. "We build it now," he said simply. "In public, with our son, with all the protections and resources my position can provide. We build the family we should have had 5 years ago, and we make sure no one ever has the power to destroy it again." Outside the farmhouse, the autumn afternoon was bright and clear, with a kind of crisp air that promised change and possibility. Inside, a family was finally coming together after years of separation and political manipulation. The storm was far from over, but for the first time in 5 years, they would face it together. Chapter 9. Truth and Consequences. The press conference was scheduled for 4 p.m. at the Obsidian Tower corporate headquarters, but by noon, supernatural news crews were already setting up equipment outside the building's gleaming entrance. The story of the secret Blackthorn heir had captured the imagination of both supernatural and human media outlets, creating a media circus that threatened to overshadow the carefully orchestrated narrative Demon was trying to establish. Celeste stood before the farmhouse's master bathroom mirror, applying makeup with hands that trembled despite her best efforts to remain calm. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a navy blue dress that projected both professionalism and maternal warmth, with a simple strand of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. The goal was to look like someone worthy of standing beside the most powerful alpha in North America, while still appearing approachable enough that public opinion might accept an unmarked Omega as the mother of a potential pack heir. "You look beautiful," Demon said from the doorway, his reflection appearing behind hers in the mirror. He'd changed into a charcoal gray suit that emphasized his authority, while softening the harsh edges that sometimes made him appear intimidating to those unfamiliar with supernatural power dynamics. "I look terrified," she corrected, setting down her lipstick and turning to face him directly. "Demon, are we doing the right thing? Once we put Phoenix in front of those cameras, once his face is broadcast to every supernatural territory in North America, there's no taking it back. There's already no taking it back, he replied gently, moving closer to rest his hands on her shoulders. His existence is public knowledge now. The question isn't whether he'll be part of this world, it's whether he'll enter it with our protection and support, or as a secret that our enemies can use against us. The logic was sound, but it didn't ease the maternal terror that had been building in her chest since they'd made the decision to go public. Phoenix was downstairs with Jennifer, blissfully unaware that his afternoon would involve television cameras and questions about his parentage that no 4-year-old should have to navigate. "What if he gets scared?" she asked, voicing the concern that had been haunting her since dawn. "What if the cameras and crowds overwhelm him?
He's just a little boy, Demon.
He doesn't understand what it means to be a Blackthorn heir." "Then we protect him," Demon said firmly. "We keep the questions age-appropriate, we limit his exposure, and we make sure he knows that no matter what happens, his parents are there to keep him safe." The word parents still felt surreal, carrying implications about shared responsibility and united decisions that they'd never had the chance to develop organically. But watching Demon's interactions with Phoenix over the past few hours had shown her glimpses of the father he could become, patient, protective, genuinely delighted by their son's curiosity and intelligence. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, studying his face for signs of the uncertainty he hid so well behind his alpha composure. "I've been ready for 5 years, he replied, his dark eyes holding hers with the kind of intensity that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. "Ready to claim you publicly, ready to give Phoenix the family he deserves, ready to stop letting other people's politics control our lives." A soft knock interrupted their conversation, followed by Phoenix's voice calling through the heavy door. "Mama? Daddy? Miss Jennifer says it's time to go to the important meeting." The innocent phrasing made Celeste smile despite her anxiety. To Phoenix, this was simply another adult event that required his best behavior and nice clothes. He had no concept of the political earthquake they were about to trigger. "Coming, little wolf," she called back, taking one last look in the mirror and trying to see herself through the eyes of the supernatural community that would be judging her fitness as a potential alpha's mate. The drive to Manhattan passed in relative silence, broken only by Phoenix's occasional questions about the tall buildings and busy streets they were passing. He sat between his parents in the back of the armored SUV, his small hand holding Celeste's while his wide eyes took in the urban landscape that was still new enough to fascinate him. "Will there be a lot of people at the meeting?" he asked as they navigated through midtown traffic that had been carefully managed by Demon's security team. "Quite a few," Demon replied honestly. "People who want to know more about our family. Some of them might ask you questions, but you only have to answer if you want to. And Mama and I will be right there with you the whole time." Phoenix nodded with the seriousness he brought to all important occasions. Mrs. Moonwhisper always said that when people ask you questions, you should tell the truth, but you don't have to tell them everything. She said some things are private, and that's okay. The wisdom of the ancient healer continued to guide Phoenix even hundreds of miles away from the southern sanctuary. Celeste made a mental note to call Mrs. Moonwhisper that evening, assuming they all survived the media circus they were walking into. Obsidian Tower's lobby had been transformed into something resembling a political campaign headquarters, with security checkpoints, media credential stations, and enough supernatural enforcement personnel to handle a small war. The building's usual corporate atmosphere had been replaced by the kind of focused intensity that accompanied major supernatural political events. Helena Morrison met them at the private elevator that would take them directly to the executive floor, her elegant composure intact despite what had to be enormous pressure from the media attention surrounding the family drama. "The press room is ready," she reported efficiently. "We've limited attendance to accredited supernatural media outlets and select human publications with established supernatural coverage policies. Questions have been pre-screened, and we've arranged for Phoenix to have a comfortable space off-camera if he needs a break." "Thank you, Helena," Demon said, his gratitude obvious despite the formal setting. "What's the mood among the assembled media?" "Curious, but respectful, for the most part." Though there are representatives from several pack territories whose alphas have been vocal about their concerns regarding succession protocols and traditional bonding requirements. The diplomatic phrasing couldn't quite hide the underlying tension. Some factions would be looking for any excuse to challenge Phoenix's legitimacy or Celeste's worthiness, and a public press conference would provide ample opportunities for hostile questions disguised as journalistic inquiry. The executive floor's conference room had been converted into a professional press facility, with a raised platform, multiple camera positions, and seating for perhaps 50 media representatives. The setup was simultaneously impressive and intimidating, designed to project authority while accommodating the supernatural community's need for transparency in pack leadership matters. "Phoenix," Celeste said, kneeling beside her son as they waited in a side room for their entrance cue, "remember what we talked about in the car. You don't have to answer any questions that make you uncomfortable, and Mama and Daddy will be right there beside you." "I remember," Phoenix said, straightening his small tie with the careful precision she taught him. "Should I tell them about my books and my dragon stories?" "If they ask about the things you like, absolutely," Demon said, crouching down to Phoenix's eye level. "And Phoenix? I want you to know how proud I am to be your father. No matter what anyone says or asks, remember that you're perfect exactly as you are." The simple declaration made Phoenix beam with a kind of uncomplicated joy that only children could display when receiving parental approval. "Ready?" Demon asked, offering his arm to Celeste while Phoenix took her other hand. "Ready," she replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. The conference room fell silent as they entered, every camera and supernatural sense focused on the family that represented either the future of pack leadership or a dangerous violation of traditional hierarchies, depending on one's political perspective. Celeste had expected to feel intimidated by the attention, but instead she found herself drawing strength from Demon's solid presence beside her and Phoenix's trusting grip on her hand. They took their places at the podium that had been arranged with chairs for all three of them, Phoenix positioned between his parents in a way that emphasized their unity as a family while keeping him slightly protected from the most direct media scrutiny. "Thank you all for coming," Demon began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that immediately commanded attention. "I've called this press conference to address recent revelations about my family and to clarify certain facts that have been subject to speculation and misinformation." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled media representatives with the kind of measured intensity that marked him as someone accustomed to controlling narrative flow. "5 years ago, I fell in love with Celeste Rivers, a brilliant and remarkable woman who has become the mother of my son and the center of my world. Due to circumstances beyond our control, circumstances that involved family manipulation and political pressure that I deeply regret, we were separated before I knew of her pregnancy." The confession sent murmurs rippling through the press room. By acknowledging the manipulation that had driven them apart, Demon was essentially admitting that pack leadership had been guilty of the kind of interference in personal relationships that violated modern supernatural ethics. "During our separation, Celeste raised our son Phoenix with courage, intelligence, and love that humbles me every day. She protected him, educated him, and gave him the foundation of strength and character that will serve him well in the years ahead." Demon's hand found Phoenix's shoulder, a gesture of paternal pride that was captured by dozens of cameras and broadcast across the supernatural community's communication networks. "Today, I want to formally acknowledge Phoenix Rivers Blackthorn as my son and heir. He carries the bloodline that has led the Shadowmere Pack for generations, and he will be raised with all the privileges, responsibilities, and protections that status entails." The formal acknowledgement was legally binding under supernatural law, making Phoenix a legitimate heir with rights that couldn't be challenged by political opponents. But it also made him a permanent target for anyone who opposed Blackthorn leadership. "Questions?" Demon said, opening the floor to the media representatives who had been waiting for this opportunity. The first question came from a reporter representing the Eastern Territories Pack Alliance, a woman whose professional demeanor couldn't quite hide the skeptical undertone of her inquiry. "Mr. Blackthorn, Pack law traditionally requires formal bonding ceremonies before offspring can be considered legitimate heirs. What steps are you taking to address the irregular circumstances of your son's birth? The question was a diplomatic way of pointing out that Phoenix had been born outside traditional pack marriage structures, making his legitimacy potentially questionable under older interpretations of supernatural law. Pack law recognizes genetic heritage above all other considerations, Demon replied smoothly. Phoenix's DNA establishes his bloodline beyond any doubt, and his intelligence and character demonstrate his fitness for eventual leadership responsibilities. As for the circumstances of his birth, they reflect the political manipulation that interfered with natural bonding processes, not any lack of commitment between his parents. Are you planning to formally bond with Miss Rivers? The reporter pressed, her tone suggesting this was the question her audience really wanted answered. Demon glanced at Celeste, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart race. Not just political calculation, but genuine emotion that had nothing to do with pack politics or media management. That, he said quietly, depends on whether she'll have me. The response sent a wave of surprised murmurs through the press room. This wasn't the carefully scripted political announcement they'd been expecting. It was a genuine expression of personal feeling that made the entire situation suddenly more human and relatable. Miss Rivers, another reporter called out before Celeste could process what had just happened. How do you respond to critics who suggest that an unmarked Omega isn't suitable as the mate of a pack alpha? The question was hostile, designed to put her on the defensive and potentially create soundbites that could be used to undermine her legitimacy. But 5 years of single motherhood and personal growth had given her strength she'd never possessed as a teenager. I respond, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room, by pointing out that I've successfully raised a remarkable child under challenging circumstances, built a career in a demanding field, and maintained my integrity despite pressures that might have broken someone with less determination. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing with the kind of confidence that could only come from knowing she'd earned her place through personal strength rather than inherited privilege. I don't need to pack politics to validate my worth as a mother or as a person. But I'm honored to be part of a family that's finally being allowed to exist openly, honestly, and with the support of people who believe love and character matter more than traditional hierarchies. The response was both diplomatic and defiant, acknowledging the political realities while refusing to apologize for her background or circumstances. Phoenix, a third reporter said, addressing the 4-year-old directly with the kind of gentle tone adults used when trying to get quotable material from children. Can you tell us how you feel about discovering your father is such an important person? Phoenix considered the question with his characteristic seriousness before answering in the clear, piping voice that carried his natural confidence. I think he's important because he's my daddy and he loves me and Mama, Phoenix said matter-of-factly. Mrs. Moonwhisper always said that people are important because of how they treat other people, not because of what jobs they have. The innocent wisdom drew chuckles from several reporters and provided exactly the kind of humanizing moment that would help public opinion accept Phoenix as more than just a political symbol. Do you have any questions for your father? The reporter continued. Phoenix turned to look at Demon with the kind of direct curiosity that only children could manage in high-pressure situations. Will you read me bedtime stories now? He asked, his question carrying all the simple hope that had been building since he'd learned his father existed. The query hit Demon with visible emotional force. Here was his son, in front of cameras and media representatives from across the supernatural community, asking not about inheritance or pack leadership or political implications, but about the basic parental connection he'd been missing for 4 years. Every night, Demon promised, his voice thick with emotion that was captured by every microphone in the room. Every single night, for as long as you want me to. Phoenix's delighted smile was probably worth more than any political calculation in terms of public opinion management. The image of a father promising bedtime stories to the son he'd just met would be broadcast across the supernatural community, humanizing the Blackthorn family in ways that no amount of media strategy could have achieved. The press conference continued for another 20 minutes, with questions about Phoenix's education, the family's living arrangements, and the political implications of his acknowledgement as Blackthorn heir. But the emotional core of the event had been established. This wasn't just a political maneuvering or succession crisis management. It was a family finally being allowed to exist openly after years of forced separation. As they left the conference room, Celeste felt cautiously optimistic about how the event had been received. Phoenix had been charming without being coached. Demon had projected authority while showing genuine emotion, and she'd managed to hold her own against potentially hostile questioning. "How do you think it went?" she asked Demon as they settled into the SUV for the return trip to the farmhouse. "Better than I hoped," he replied, his arms settling around Phoenix, who had curled up against his father's side with the trusting abandonment of a tired 4-year-old. The coverage should be positive, and Phoenix was absolutely perfect. "I liked answering questions," Phoenix mumbled against Demon's shoulder. "But I'm sleepy now." "Sleep, little wolf," Celeste said softly, smoothing his hair while her heart swelled with love for the brave, amazing child who had just navigated his first public appearance with grace and charm that would have challenged many adults. But as Manhattan's skyline receded behind them, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenges were just beginning. Public acknowledgement was one thing. Building a family and navigating the ongoing political pressures would require entirely different skills and much more time. The press conference had been the easy part. Chapter 10. Forever Under the Moon. 6 months later, the harvest moon hung full and radiant above the Blackthorn estate, casting silver light across gardens that had been transformed into something from a supernatural fairy tale. Hundreds of candles flickered among the ancient oaks, while garlands of autumn flowers created natural archways that seemed to glow with their own inner magic. The air hummed with the kind of ancient power that marked the most sacred ceremonies in supernatural tradition, the formal bonding of true mates under the witness of the moon and pack. Celeste stood before the full-length mirror in what had once been Magnus Blackthorn's private study, now converted into a bridal suite that bore no trace of the old patriarch's cold, calculating presence. The room had been completely transformed, filled with soft fabrics, fresh flowers, and the kind of warm, welcoming energy that spoke to new beginnings rather than old power structures. Her wedding dress was a masterpiece of supernatural craftsmanship, flowing silk that seemed to capture and hold moonlight, with intricate beadwork that told the story of wolves finding their way home after years of wandering. The gown had been a gift from Valentina Morrison, who had surprised everyone by becoming not just an ally in the complex dissolution of her arranged marriage, but a genuine friend who seemed to find joy in helping others claim the love she'd never been able to find for herself. "You look like a moon goddess," Helena Morrison said, fastening the final clasp on a necklace that had belonged to Demon's mother, the first Mrs. Blackthorn to marry for love rather than political advantage. "Demon is going to take one look at you and forget every word of the vows he's been practicing for weeks." Celeste touched the delicate silver pendant at her throat, feeling the weight of history and the promise of a future that seemed almost too good to be true. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media management, political negotiations, and the delicate work of building a life together after 5 years of separation. The dissolution of Demon's marriage to Valentina had been handled with the kind of diplomatic grace that preserved everyone's dignity while acknowledging the obvious truth that their union had been political rather than personal. Valentina had emerged from the process with enhanced status as a mediator and advisor, her intelligence and political skills finally being utilized in ways that didn't require sacrificing her personal happiness. Phoenix had adapted to his new life with the resilience that seemed to be his defining characteristic. He'd moved from the farmhouse to a wing of the Blackthorn estate that had been converted into child-friendly living space, complete with a playroom that rivaled anything found in the most exclusive private schools. His days were filled with private tutors who challenged his remarkable intellect, security personnel who had become surrogate aunts and uncles, and most importantly, a father who kept his promise about bedtime stories every single night. "Mama, are you ready?" Phoenix's voice came through the door, followed by what sounded like him hopping from foot to foot with excitement. He'd been looking forward to the bonding ceremony for weeks, thrilled by his role as ring bearer and the prospect of finally having the complete family he'd dreamed about for so long. "Almost, little wolf," she called back, taking one final look at her reflection and trying to process the fact that in less than an hour, she would be officially mated to the man she'd loved since she was 18 years old. The door opened to admit Phoenix, resplendent in a miniature version of Demon's formal wear, his unruly hair finally tamed for the occasion through what had probably been considerable effort on the part of his father and Helena combined. "Wow," he breathed, staring at his mother with a kind of awe that only 5-year-olds could display when confronted with something that exceeded their ability to process. "You look like a princess from one of my books." "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, kneeling carefully to avoid wrinkling her dress while she straightened his tiny bow tie. "You look very handsome yourself. Are you ready to help Daddy and me with our special ceremony?" "I've been practicing with the rings all week," Phoenix announced proudly. "Helena showed me how to walk slow and keep them safe and not trip on the flowers." The mention of flower petals reminded her that the ceremony would be taking place outdoors, under the open sky where pack traditions dictated that moon ceremonies should be witnessed by the celestial body that governed supernatural bonding. The October evening was crisp but not cold, perfect for the kind of ancient ritual that connected modern wolves to their ancestral heritage. "Phoenix," she said, capturing his attention with the serious tone she used for important conversations, "after tonight, we're going to be a real family. Daddy and I will be officially mated, and you'll be our son in every way that matters under pack law. Are you happy about that?" "I've been happy about that since the first day I met Daddy," Phoenix replied with the matter-of-fact certainty that characterized his approach to most family matters. "I just want to know if I should call you and Daddy different names now, or if Mama and Daddy are still okay." The question made her heart swell with love for the thoughtful child who had somehow emerged from 5 years of uncertainty and upheaval with his capacity for joy and trust intact. "Mama and Daddy are perfect," she assured him. "Some things don't need to change just because they become official." A soft knock interrupted their conversation, followed by Jennifer's voice announcing that it was time for the ceremony to begin. Phoenix immediately straightened with a kind of focused attention he brought to all important responsibilities, checking his pocket to ensure the rings were secure before offering his mother his arm with old-fashioned courtesy that would have made any parent proud. The gardens had been transformed into something from a supernatural fairy tale. Hundreds of pack members and supernatural dignitaries filled elegant seating that had been arranged in concentric circles around a natural clearing where ancient stone formations created a sacred space for bonding ceremonies. The guest list read like a directory of supernatural power, alpha families from across the continent, business leaders whose influence shaped both worlds, and political figures whose support had been crucial in legitimizing Phoenix's status as Blackthorn heir. But as Celeste walked down the petal-strewn path with Phoenix at her side, she barely noticed the assembled crowd. Her attention was focused entirely on the man waiting for her at the center of the clearing, surrounded by moonlight and the kind of ancient magic that had been blessing supernatural unions for millennia. Demon stood beneath an archway of intertwined branches that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, dressed in formal attire that emphasized both his authority as Pack Alpha and his role as the groom in what was clearly a love match rather than a political arrangement. His dark eyes found hers across the distance that separated them, and she saw in their depths all the love, grief, joy, and promise that had brought them through 5 years of separation to this moment of claiming each other publicly and permanently. The officiant was an ancient wolf whose human form bore the silver hair and knowing eyes of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of entire pack dynasties. Elder Moonwhisper had made the journey from the southern sanctuary specifically for this ceremony, her presence serving as both blessing and bridge between Celeste's past and her future. "Dearly beloved," the elder began, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd with a kind of authority that came from decades of conducting the most sacred supernatural ceremonies. "We gather tonight under the witness of the harvest moon to celebrate the bonding of two souls who have found their way back to each other despite the forces that sought to keep them apart." Phoenix stepped forward with careful precision, offering the rings to Elder Moonwhisper with the kind of serious attention he brought to all important responsibilities. The elder smiled at him with genuine warmth before continuing with the ancient words that had united supernatural mates for generations. "Demon Blackthorn, Alpha of the Shadowmere Pack. Do you come before your pack and the moon to claim Celeste Rivers as your mate, your partner, your equal in all things that matter? I do, Demon replied, his voice carrying clearly through the night air. I claim her not just as my mate, but as the woman who gave me the greatest gift of my life, our son Phoenix. I claim her as my partner in leadership, my companion in joy and sorrow, and my anchor in the storms that may come. Celeste Rivers, Elder Moonwhisper continued, do you come before this pack and the moon to claim Demon Blackthorn as your mate, knowing that you will share not just his love, but his responsibilities as pack leader? I do, Celeste said, surprised by how steady her voice remained despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. I claim him as my mate, my partner, and my choice. I claim the life we should have had 5 years ago, and the future we'll build together with our son. The formal words were important for legal and traditional reasons, but it was the personal vows that followed that brought tears to the eyes of even the most jaded political observers. Celeste, Demon said, taking her hands as they faced each other in the circle of ancient stones, 5 years ago, I thought I lost you forever. I spent those years believing I'd failed to protect what mattered most, carrying guilt and regret that nearly destroyed me. But tonight, under this moon, I make you a promise that no force on earth will ever separate us again. His voice grew stronger, carrying the weight of absolute commitment. I promise to be the father Phoenix deserves, not perfect, but present. I promise to be the partner you need, supporting your strength, sharing your burdens, celebrating your victories. And I promise to love you with everything I am, for all the years we have together and beyond. Demon, Celeste replied, her own voice thick with emotion, you gave me the greatest gift of my life when you gave me Phoenix. But tonight, you're giving me something even more precious, the chance to build the family we dreamed of when we were too young to understand how rare and precious true love really is. She squeezed his hands, drawing strength from his solid presence and the knowledge that this time, no one could force them apart. I promise to stand beside you as your mate and partner, to share the responsibilities of leadership while maintaining my own strength and independence. I promise to help you raise Phoenix to be strong and kind and brave. And I promise to love you not despite our complicated past, but because of it, because it taught us both what really matters. Elder Moonwhisper raised her hands, calling down the ancient blessings that would complete their bonding under supernatural law. The assembled crowd fell silent as power began to gather in the clearing, moonlight growing brighter as the celestial witness added its approval to their union. By the authority of pack law, supernatural tradition, and the blessing of the moon that watches over all wolves, I pronounce you mated for life, the elder intoned. May your bond strengthen with time, may your love deepen with each passing year, and may your family know peace and prosperity for generations to come. The kiss that sealed their bonding was both tender and passionate, carrying 5 years of longing and the promise of forever. Around them, the assembled crowd erupted into celebration, howls of approval from pack members, applause from human allies, and the kind of joyful noise that marked truly happy occasions. But for Celeste, the world had narrowed to the man holding her in his arms and the son who threw himself at both of them with a delighted squeal of, "We're a real family now." The reception that followed was a blend of elegant sophistication and genuine warmth, with guests from across the supernatural community celebrating not just a political alliance, but a genuine love story that had overcome impossible odds. Phoenix held court among the adults who were charmed by his intelligence and natural charisma, while his parents danced to music that seemed to be provided as much by the wind through the ancient oaks as by the professional musicians. Any regrets? Demon asked as they swayed together under the stars, their formal attire forgotten in favor of simply holding each other close. About which part? Celeste replied, looking up at him with eyes that held nothing but joy and contentment. About falling in love with you when we were 18? About having your son in secret? About coming back to fight for our family? About any of it. All of it. His arms tightened around her, as if he were still afraid she might disappear if he didn't hold on tight enough. No regrets, she said firmly. Not about loving you, not about Phoenix, not about the years of separation that taught us both who we really are. Everything we went through brought us to this moment, and this moment is perfect. Across the dance floor, Phoenix was attempting to teach Helena Morrison the complicated hand-clapping game he'd learned from his preschool friends, his laughter carrying across the gardens like music. Valentina Morrison sat at a nearby table, engaged in animated conversation with several pack alphas about new approaches to interterritorial cooperation, her intelligence finally being utilized in ways that brought her satisfaction rather than resignation. "He's going to be an amazing leader someday," Demon said, following her gaze to their son. "Strong like his mother, diplomatic like his father, and wise beyond his years because he's learned that love is worth fighting for." "Someday," Celeste agreed. "But for now, he gets to be a little boy with parents who love him and a family that will always be there for him." As the evening wound toward its close, the three of them found themselves alone on the estate's main balcony, looking out over grounds that had been transformed by love and determination from a place of cold ambition into something that felt genuinely like home. Phoenix had fallen asleep against his father's shoulder, exhausted by the excitement of the day, but peaceful in the way that children slept when they felt completely safe and loved. Celeste leaned into Demon's free arm, marveling at how natural it felt to stand there as a family, how right it seemed after years of separation and uncertainty. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, voicing the question that had been lingering in the back of her mind throughout the celebration. "Now," Demon said, his voice soft with contentment and promise. "We live. We raise our son. We lead our pack. We build the life we should have had years ago. We love each other openly, honestly, with all the support and protection that my position can provide. And if your enemies try to challenge us again?" His smile held the kind of dangerous certainty that reminded her exactly how powerful and protective he could be when his family was threatened. Then they'll discover that the Blackthorn legacy isn't built on political manipulation and arranged marriages. It's built on love, loyalty, and the kind of strength that comes from having something worth protecting. Above them, the harvest moon continued its ancient journey across the star-scattered sky, bearing witness to promises made and kept, to love that had survived separation and emerged stronger, to a family that had finally been allowed to claim its place in the world. In the distance, a wolf howled, not with loneliness or longing, but with the kind of joy that marked pack territory where the alpha and his mate were truly content. Other voices joined the celebration, creating a symphony of supernatural satisfaction that would carry across the territories, announcing to anyone who cared to listen that the Shadowmere pack had found its heart again. Celeste closed her eyes and added her own voice to the song, her wolf spirit singing with happiness as Luna finally claimed her mate and her place in the world. Demon's howl harmonized with hers, their voices blending in ways that spoke to bonds deeper than human understanding, while Phoenix stirred sleepily in his father's arms and smiled at the music his parents were making together. The moon smiled down on the family that had fought so hard to exist, blessing their union with silver light and ancient approval. In the supernatural community, their love story would be told for generations, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of defying tradition, but as proof that true mates would always find their way back to each other, no matter what forces tried to keep them apart. Some stories, as it turned out, really were meant to have happy endings. 2 years later, the nursery in the Blackthorn Estate's family wing was painted in soft yellows and greens, with murals depicting peaceful forest scenes and windows that caught the morning light in ways that made everything seem touched by magic. Phoenix, now 7 years old and growing into his role as big brother with characteristic determination, sat in the rocking chair beside the crib, reading a story about brave dragons to the infant who watched him with a kind of rapt attention that suggested she found his voice far more interesting than the colorful pictures. And then the dragon learned that her fire wasn't scary, Phoenix was saying, his voice carrying the patient tone he used when explaining important concepts to his baby sister. It was beautiful, and it helped keep everyone safe and warm. Luna Sophia Blackthorn, 6 months old and already showing signs of inheriting her family's intelligence and stubborn streak, gurgled appreciatively at the story, while her tiny fist grasped at the toy dragon Phoenix held just within her reach. She likes the dragon stories best, Phoenix announced as his parents appeared in the nursery doorway. I think she's going to be brave like you and Mama. She's lucky to have such a good big brother to teach her about being brave, Celeste said, settling into the window seat with Luna in her arms while Phoenix climbed onto his father's lap with the easy affection that marked their relationship. Demon's arm came around both his children, his expression holding the kind of quiet contentment that spoke to dreams fulfilled and promises kept. The past 2 years had brought challenges, political opposition, media scrutiny, the complex work of modernizing pact traditions while respecting their essential wisdom, but they'd faced each obstacle together, as a family united by love and strengthened by the knowledge that they'd already survived the worst that could be thrown at them. Daddy, Phoenix said, settling more comfortably against his father's chest, when Luna gets bigger, will you tell her about how you and Mama found each other again? When she's old enough to understand, Demon promised. I'll tell her about how love is stronger than politics, how family is worth fighting for, and how sometimes the most important victories are the ones where everyone wins in the end. Will you tell her about Mrs. Moonwhisper too? Phoenix asked. And about how she taught me that being different isn't scary, it's special? I'll tell her all of it, Celeste promised, watching as Luna's eyes began to drift closed in the peaceful way of babies who felt completely safe and loved. The good parts and the hard parts, and how they all led us to this moment. Outside the nursery windows, the Blackthorn Estate's gardens showed the first signs of spring, new growth emerging from soil that had weathered winter storms, ancient trees putting forth fresh leaves that caught the morning light like promises of renewal. The sight was both beautiful and symbolic, a reminder that even the strongest foundations could support new growth when tended with love and patience. I love our family, Phoenix announced with the matter-of-fact certainty that characterized his approach to most emotional truths. So do I, little wolf, Celeste replied, her heart full to overflowing as she looked around at the life they'd built together, messy and complicated and absolutely perfect in all the ways that mattered. So do I, Demon agreed, his voice carrying all the wonder of a man who had never quite gotten over the miracle of being allowed to keep the people he loved most. The future stretched ahead of them, filled with possibilities they were finally free to pursue together. Phoenix would grow into his heritage with parents who understood both its privileges and its responsibilities. Luna would learn about strength and love and the importance of choosing your own path from a family who had proven those lessons through their own choices. And somewhere in the southern sanctuary, an ancient healer smiled as she felt the happiness radiating from the family she had helped guide toward their destiny, knowing that her teachings about bravery and truth and the power of love had taken root in fertile ground and would flourish for generations to come. The moon that had witnessed their bonding continued its eternal journey across the sky, carrying with it the stories of wolves who had found their way home despite impossible odds. And in the Blackthorn nursery, a family built on love rather than politics settled into the peaceful rhythm of ordinary happiness, the most extraordinary gift of all. Moonlit souls, that concludes our tale of Celeste and Demon, the love that refused to be denied, and the family that proved stronger than any force that tried to tear it apart. If Destiny's pulse stirred your heart tonight, don't forget to howl at that like button, share this story with your pack, and return for more supernatural romances that prove love really can conquer all. Until next time, may your own love stories be written in starlight and sealed with moonbeams. The end.